Section 1. The nature of Family Guy controversy. There is a particular kind of animated show that lives in a very specific space between what television is allowed to say and what it decides to say anyway. Family Guy has occupied that space for over 2 decades, and during that time it has done something very few shows ever manage. It has made people genuinely angry, genuinely moved, genuinely offended, and occasionally genuinely impressed, sometimes all within the same 22 minutes. This video is not about ranking whether Family Guy is good or bad. That conversation has been had 1,000 times over in comment sections and Reddit threads and YouTube essays stretching back into the early days of the internet. What this is about is something more specific. It is about the moments where the show crossed a line, or tried to, or stumbled over one without meaning to, and what happened when it did. The episodes that got banned, the ones that drew fire from governments and advocacy groups and parents and politicians, the ones that forced the writers into public apologies or public defiance, the ones that sparked debates about what animated comedy is actually allowed to do. Family Guy has always understood something fundamental about the nature of controversy. It is not just about shock. Shock on its own is easy. You can shock someone by putting something unexpected on screen. They will react, and then the reaction passes and nothing lingers. Real controversy is different. Real controversy sticks around because it touches something people actually care about. It makes them question something they believe, or it reminds them of something painful, or it forces a face onto an issue they would rather not look at. The episodes we are going to walk through tonight manage to do all of those things, and the reactions they provoked tell us as much about the culture they landed in as they do about the show itself. To understand why Family Guy became the lightning rod that it did, you have to go back to the 31st of January, 1999, when the show premiered on Fox immediately following Super Bowl 33, the single best time slot in American television. The premiere pulled in around 22 million viewers. The show introduced the Griffin family: Peter, the overweight and not especially bright father; Lois, the patient and put-upon wife; their teenagers, Meg and Chris; the baby Stewie, who harbored world domination schemes beneath an innocent exterior; and Brian, the family dog who walked upright, drank martinis, and was the closest thing to a functioning adult in the household. From the very first episodes, the show was combative. It made jokes about race, religion, sex, politics, and death. It deployed cutaway gags that went places other animated shows would not go. It was irreverent, in a specific, knowing way, the kind of irreverence that comes from people who have studied comedy carefully and decided to push against its established limits, not out of nihilism, but out of the conviction that the limits were arbitrary. Seth MacFarlane, who created the show at 25 and voiced 4 of its main characters simultaneously, was a young animator who had grown up absorbing Golden Age cartoons, classic Hollywood musicals, British comedy, and Saturday Night Live. And Family Guy was the place where all of those influences collided and exploded outward. The show had a rocky early history. Fox canceled it in 2002 after repeatedly moving it around the schedule without warning, making it impossible for audiences to develop the habit of watching. It was briefly reprieved, canceled again, and most observers assumed it was finished. What happened next changed the trajectory of American animated television. Cartoon Network acquired the rerun rights for almost nothing and began airing episodes in their Adult Swim block in April of 2003. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Family Guy became the highest-rated program on the block, boosting Adult Swim's viewership by 239%. DVD sales of the first 2 seasons exceeded 400,000 copies in the first months of release. Fox ordered new episodes, and the show returned in May 2005 for its 4th season, beginning one of the most sustained runs in the history of animated television. The show that returned was not quite the same show that had been canceled. The writing staff had been partially scattered during the 3-year gap. The tone had shifted. Some of the warmth that characterized the early seasons had begun to thin out, and as the show grew more comfortable in its revived form, it also grew more willing to push into genuinely difficult territory that would eventually generate international news coverage, congressional attention, formal FCC complaints, and a complete ban from a foreign government. The Parents Television Council had been targeting the show almost from the beginning. They placed it on their worst primetime programs list in 2000, 2005, and 2006, and organized letter-writing campaigns against Fox and the show's advertisers. This attention had a paradoxical effect. Every complaint and every news story about complaints served to amplify the show's reputation as something genuinely transgressive and worth paying attention to. The PTC's war against Family Guy functioned partly as free advertising. The FCC received formal complaints about Family Guy episodes and proposed significant fines against Fox affiliates at least once. The tension between the show and federal broadcast regulators would eventually become the subject of one of the most argumentatively coherent episodes in the show's history, which we will examine later tonight. Understanding all of this context matters because the controversies we are about to discuss did not arise in a vacuum. They arose from a show that was in constant, active tension with the institutions and cultural forces that wanted to limit what it could say. Some of that tension was productive, some was not. But all of it was real, and the episodes that emerged from it carry the marks of that tension in ways that reward close examination. So settle in, let the night go quiet around you. We are going to walk through the episodes that made Family Guy genuinely controversial, not just edgy or adult-oriented, but actually and substantively contested, and by the end, you will have a much clearer picture of what the show was really doing with all that noise, and what the noise was really saying back. Drop a comment and tell me where you are in the world and what time it is where you are watching this. I love knowing who is out there. And if you have been enjoying what we do here, subscribing costs you nothing and helps this kind of long-form content continue. Section 2. Partial Terms of Endearment. The episode America Never Saw. There is a moment in the history of any long-running television show when it attempts something that genuinely surprises the network airing it. Not in the way of pushing limits on language or violence or sexual content. Family Guy had been doing that from its first season. This was something different. This was a case where the subject matter itself was so politically charged, so thoroughly embedded in the deepest divisions of American civic life, that the network looked at a completed episode they had already paid for and decided they would simply not show it to anyone. The episode was Partial Terms of Endearment. It was the 21st episode of the 8th season, produced in 2010, written by Danny Smith and directed by Joseph Lee. It aired on BBC Three in the United Kingdom on the 20th of June 2010. In the United States on Fox, on Adult Swim, on TBS, on FXX, on local syndication, and on every streaming platform that carries Family Guy including Hulu and Disney+, it has never been available. It remains the only Family Guy episode that cannot be watched through any normal American channel or streaming service. If you want to see it and you live in the United States, your only legal option is a standalone DVD release from September 2010. The reason is abortion. The episode's premise is carefully constructed to arrive at this subject through a legitimate narrative path. Lois reconnects with an old college friend named Naomi, voiced by Julia Sweeney. Naomi and her husband Dale are unable to conceive and ask Lois to serve as a surrogate mother. Lois agrees after genuine deliberation. She goes through the medical process, becomes pregnant, and the pregnancy proceeds. Then Naomi and Dale are killed in a car accident, leaving Lois carrying a fetus that belongs biologically to two people who are now dead. She must decide what to do, carry the pregnancy to term, and give the baby up for adoption or have an abortion. By the end of the episode, Lois chooses the abortion. The choice is communicated at almost comically compressed speed in the final seconds before the credits. Peter announces it in a rush, as if the show is trying to deliver the information while it still has the nerve, but the choice is made and it is final. Seth MacFarlane was explicit about what he was trying to accomplish. He had watched Kevin Costner's 2008 film Swing Vote, in which a presidential election comes down to a single voter, and the film ends without revealing how the man voted, and found the ending artistically cowardly. He wanted Partial Terms of Endearment to commit. Lois would face a real decision and actually make it. Kevin Riley, then president of Fox, was also explicit in his public defense of the network's decision not to air the episode. He told the New York Times that abortion was an extremely fragile subject matter at an extremely fragile economic time, and described it as the hottest possible button he could imagine a show pressing. He acknowledged the episode felt like it could cause trouble and concluded simply that it was not worth it. MacFarlane noted in subsequent interviews that part of the problem for Fox was the vocabulary involved. Simply saying the word abortion, not dancing around it, not using euphemisms, was itself enough to trigger defensive calculations about advertisers and political blowback. He also mentioned that the script contained a joke referencing the World Trade Center, and that even the word Al-Qaeda in a comedic context had made network representatives uncomfortable, not because the episode was disrespectful to anyone, but because proximity to that vocabulary created association risks that nobody wanted to carry. The episode's actual content was considerably more thoughtful than its suppression might suggest. Reviews from the United Kingdom, where it aired without incident, were largely positive. Critics praised it for being more structurally coherent and emotionally engaged than a typical Family Guy episode while still maintaining the show's signature comedic rhythm. Peter's role in the story is handled with real satirical precision. He begins opposed to the whole surrogacy arrangement on no principled grounds, simply because it is inconvenient and strange. When Naomi and Dale die and the question of what to do with the pregnancy arises, he ends up on the anti-abortion side, but for completely wrong reasons. He gets swept up in a crowd of protesters and absorbs their energy and their language, not because he has thought through any of the underlying questions, but because he is always susceptible to whatever social current he finds himself swimming in. He is not a man of sincere conviction. He is a man who reflects whatever environment he is placed in, and the episode uses this perfectly accurately rather than as a betrayal of his character. Lois's deliberation is treated with genuine respect. She is genuinely troubled by the choice. She considers both options seriously. She does not arrive at a conclusion until the episode has given her real time to deliberate. Whether you agree with the choice she ultimately makes or not, the episode treats the deliberation as deserving of serious attention, which is more than can be said for many mainstream American treatments of the subject. The irony of the episode's American non-existence is how quickly the media landscape around it changed. Multiple television series have since handled abortion directly, some with considerably less care than this episode showed, and none generated anything close to the institutional panic that this single Family Guy episode provoked in 2010. BoJack Horseman addressed abortion with extraordinary emotional intelligence. Crazy Ex-Girlfriend included an abortion storyline that received widespread praise. Even medical dramas went through the procedure step by step in later years. The conversation has shifted dramatically. For people who track Family Guy history carefully, the episode's absence from American streaming is one of those facts that functions as a kind of ghost, something you can feel the shape of in the space where it should be. Every other episode is there. Every edgy joke, every transgression across more than 20 seasons is accessible to American audiences. Just not this one, the one that made a woman make a choice, the one that said the word out loud. Section 3. Screams of silence when Family Guy tried to get serious and almost made things worse. There is a particular danger that comes with asking a show built on irreverence to suddenly be earnest. The risk is that the earnestness will be so badly calibrated, so clumsily deployed, so out of step with the show's established rhythms, that it will end up doing more damage than the irreverence ever could. Screams of silence. The story of Brenda Q is the most complete illustration of that risk in Family Guy history. It is an episode that genuinely wanted to say something important about domestic violence, and it said it so poorly that advocacy groups and critics lined up to explain exactly where it had gone wrong. The episode aired on the 30th of October 2011 as the third episode of Season 10. Written by Alex Sulkin and directed by Dominic Bianchi, it centers on Glenn Quagmire's sister, Brenda, voiced by Caitlin Olsen. Brenda is in an abusive relationship with a man named Jeff. Jeff hits her. Jeff controls her. Jeff does what abusers do. He isolates her, undermines her self-worth, and alternates between cruelty and apparent affection in the cycle that keeps people trapped in these situations long past the point where leaving seems like a rational possibility. When Quagmire, Peter, and Joe Swanson encounter Jeff and Brenda at a family gathering, the abuse is visible enough that the three men decide they need to intervene. The episode makes a decision here that was clearly intended as meaningful. It plays the domestic violence completely straight. The abuse is not cushioned by comedy. There is no cutaway gag, no ironic music, no signal that the audience should be amused rather than disturbed. The abuse is presented as genuinely disturbing. This was the right instinct. The problem is with everything built around it. The intervention scene is where the episode reveals the depth of its misunderstanding. When Quagmire, Peter, and Joe sit down with Brenda to help her see the situation clearly, the arguments they make are a parade of the most damaging myths about domestic violence that exist in popular culture. They tell her she just needs to leave, that Jeff does not love her, that no real man treats a woman this way, that she should be able to look at the situation objectively and simply choose differently. Every single one of these arguments, however well-intentioned in the mouths of sympathetic characters, represents a fundamental failure to understand what actually keeps people in abusive relationships. People in these situations do not stay because they cannot perceive the abuse. They stay because of trauma bonding, economic dependency, isolation from support networks, fear of retaliation, and the cycle of violence and remorse and reconciliation that keeps hope alive long past the point where it is rational. The research on this is substantial and consistent. Telling someone in an abusive relationship to just leave is, as actual domestic violence advocates will tell you, one of the least helpful things you can say, because it ignores all of the actual mechanisms that make leaving extraordinarily difficult and dangerous. The episode presents none of this complexity. Brenda is written as someone who simply has not yet been talked into making the right choice, and the intervention as the process of providing the necessary talking. This places responsibility for the continued abuse on Brenda rather than on Jeff, which is one of the most pervasive and most harmful myths surrounding intimate partner violence. The episode communicates, consciously or not, that the reason the abuse continues is that Brenda has not listened hard enough. The resolution compounds the problems. Quagmire, with Peter and Joe's knowledge and Joe's silent complicity as a police officer, kills Jeff in the woods. This is presented as the correct and even satisfying outcome. Vigilante murder is offered as the appropriate response to domestic violence. Joe, who as a police officer has legal tools available, instead enables and witnesses the killing without consequence. And then Brenda simply disappears from the show, appearing in no subsequent episodes for years, without any exploration of whether she actually healed. Critics and advocacy groups recognize the failures immediately. The episode was widely condemned for how it framed the dynamics of abuse and the nature of effective intervention. The comparison with other media that had handled the same subject is damning. Courage the Cowardly Dog, a children's cartoon, handled an abusive relationship storyline with far more psychological accuracy and emotional intelligence in its episode, The Mask. That episode showed the complexity of attachment in abusive relationships, the way love and fear and dependency coexist, and the reality that recovery requires genuine internal change rather than simply the removal of the abuser. 12 minutes. For children. More thoughtful than what this adult animated series managed. The episode consistently appears at or near the top of lists, ranking the worst Family Guy episodes ever produced. Its WatchMojo ranking placed it at number 1 on the list of the 20 worst episodes. The critical consensus is consistent. The ambition exceeded the understanding, and the gap between them caused genuine harm. Caitlin Olsen, who voiced Brenda, is by any measure one of the most skilled comedic performers in American television. Her work on It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia demonstrates an extraordinary ability to make extreme, difficult characters simultaneously funny and human. She brought real vocal emotion to Brenda, but even strong performance cannot rescue a script that has fundamentally mischaracterized the psychological reality it is trying to portray. Screams of Silence is an episode that genuinely wanted to be better than it was. The impulse to use the show's platform to say something meaningful about domestic violence was not a wrong impulse. The execution failed that impulse completely. It gave people watching who might have been experiencing abuse the message that they should simply listen to their friends, that the solution is for someone else to take dramatic action on their behalf, that the complexity of their situation is their fault for not having overcome it yet. These are precisely the wrong messages. Section 4. Seahorse Seashell Party, the episode that gave Meg a voice and then took it away. Season 10 of Family Guy, in the space of 2 consecutive episodes, produced 2 of the most discussed and debated installments in the show's entire run. We have talked about Screams of Silence. The episode before it, which aired on October 2nd, 2011, was called Seahorse Seashell Party, and it generated a very different kind of conversation. Where Screams of Silence was criticized for handling a serious topic poorly, Seahorse Seashell Party was criticized for something almost more troubling, for apparently handling a serious topic well, and then pulling the rug out at the last possible moment in a way that undermined the entire emotional argument the episode had been building toward. The premise is a hurricane. The Griffin family is trapped inside their home by a massive storm. The forced proximity strips away the usual buffers between the characters. Brian, in the episode's most original narrative choice, takes psychedelic mushrooms to manage his anxiety and spends the episode in a hallucinatory state that gives him a peculiar kind of distance, the sort of distance that sometimes speaks uncomfortable truths. Meanwhile, inside the house, a pressure that has been building for several seasons reaches its boiling point. Meg Griffin, who by season 10 had spent years serving as the designated target of her family's cruelty, insulted by Peter, treated with increasing coldness by Lois, mocked by Chris, barely acknowledged by Stewie, treated by everyone as something less than a full person deserving basic dignity, finally snaps. She turns to her family and says everything that is true. She calls out Peter for being a terrible father. She names specific behaviors, specific failures, specific moments of cruelty. She calls out Lois for her inadequacy as a mother, for her coldness, for the ways she has both neglected and actively participated in Meg's mistreatment. She is precise and honest and devastating, and the speech is, by the standards of what this show was producing in its 10th season, remarkable writing. It reads like something that had been building inside the writer's room for years, all the accumulated awareness of what the show had been doing to this character finally finding a release valve. For viewers who had been watching Meg get destroyed season after season, the speech landed like something physical. It felt like justice arriving at last. Like the show was finally acknowledging that what it had been doing to this character was wrong, that Meg was a person with legitimate grievances, and that the people hurting her were genuinely accountable. The speech was immediately celebrated, shared widely, quoted in discussions of the show as evidence that Family Guy could still produce emotionally honest writing when it wanted to. And then the episode arrived at its conclusion. After Meg's confrontation, the family falls apart without its shared target. Without Meg absorbing all the dysfunction, Peter and Lois and Chris begin to tear into each other. The family unit starts to fracture. Brian, in his hallucinatory state, explains to Meg what is happening. He tells her that she is the family's lightning rod, that by absorbing their cruelty, she is performing a structural function, that without her willingness to take the abuse, the family cannot survive intact, that she is, in effect, the load-bearing wall. The episode ends with Meg accepting this framing. She returns to her family. She takes back what she said. She voluntarily resumes her position as the one everyone picks on, because the episode has constructed this as the loving, selfless choice, the choice that keeps the family functional at the cost of her own well-being. The reaction was immediate and has not softened with time. The episode is consistently cited not as a Meg redemption moment, but as one of the most morally confused decisions in the show's history. Because the message it delivers explicitly, through Brian's hallucinatory speech and Meg's voluntary acceptance, is that victims of sustained abuse should accept their role if their suffering is load-bearing for the people around them. That standing up for yourself is selfish when the systems that harm you depend on your willingness to be harmed. That the correct, loving response to years of mistreatment is to quietly return to being mistreated. This is not a subtle reading requiring a particular critical lens to find. Brian states it plainly. Meg accepts it plainly. The episode frames this as the resolution rather than as the tragedy. The music, the pacing, the complete absence of any ironic framing, everything signals that the audience is meant to feel something close to satisfaction at how things have settled. The episode was written by Wellesley Wild and directed by Brian Iles. It aired to 6.99 million viewers, one of the stronger numbers of that stretch of the season. And it became one of the most argued about episodes in the show's history because it came so close to doing something genuinely good. The speech is real. The writing that produced it is honest and careful, and then refused to follow that good thing through to any meaningful conclusion. What Seahorse Seashell Party ultimately reveals is Family Guy's unwillingness to risk genuine change. The show would acknowledge that its characters were doing wrong things, it would give those wrong things their full emotional weight, and then it would snap back to exactly where it had been, because the status quo was commercially and narratively safer than growth. The cruelty toward Meg did decrease in later seasons, significantly so after the addition of more women to the writing staff, who pushed back against the sustained abuse more effectively. By season 22, the extreme treatment had largely stopped, but the philosophical statement made by Seahorse Seashell Party that victim compliance with abuse is a form of selfless love lingered as one of the stranger things this show ever chose to argue. Section 5. The Cleveland Loretta Quagmire, Adultery, Race, and Incomplete Accountability. The The Cleveland-Loretta Quagmire aired on the 5th of June 2005 as the 11th episode of the 4th season. It was directed by Seth Kearsley and written by Mark Henteman. The premise centers on one of the ugliest possible intersections between the show's four main male characters. Quagmire, whose entire characterization had been built around the joke of his sexually aggressive pursuit of women since the show's first season, has an affair with Loretta Brown, who is Cleveland's wife. Cleveland Brown was, at this point, one of very few black characters in the core ensemble. He had been defined throughout the show's earlier seasons by a gentle, soft-spoken personality, a deliberate contrast to Peter's loudness and Quagmire's aggression. His marriage to Loretta had been referenced as something genuine and meaningful. When Cleveland discovers the affair, his reaction is handled more seriously than almost any emotional beat the show had produced up to that point. His devastation is real within the fictional world. The episode, to its credit in this specific moment, allows Cleveland's pain to be real. The racial dimension of what the episode had constructed was present whether or not it was acknowledged. The dynamic of Quagmire, a white character whose sexual aggression had been the show's running joke for seasons, having an affair with the black female character attached to the show's black male character, activated cultural associations that the episode did not address. This is not evidence of malicious intent on the part of the writers. There is no reason to believe the racial dynamics were a deliberate choice, but not intending to invoke certain associations does not make those associations invisible, and the absence of any acknowledgement means they existed in the episode unchallenged. The resolution or lack thereof is where the episode becomes most difficult to defend. Cleveland confronts Quagmire. There is a physical altercation. The friendship is essentially restored. Quagmire's behavior, which would in any realistic framework constitute a profound betrayal of a close friend, is treated as one of those things that happens when you have a character whose function is to be sexually voracious without consequences. The accountability is minimal. Loretta, the third party in the affair, is written as bearing substantial blame for what happened. She will subsequently leave Cleveland and exit the show entirely, her departure setting up Cleveland's eventual spin-off series, The Cleveland Show, which aired on Fox from 2009 to 2013. In that show, Cleveland moved back to his hometown, remarried, and built a new family, but the seeds of his departure from Family Guy were planted in this episode, which fundamentally altered his domestic situation in ways the show could not easily walk back. The episode is actually one of the more structurally ambitious things the revival-era show attempted. The premise is dark, and the episode commits to it. Cleveland's pain is palpable, but Family Guy at this point was not built to fully process what it generated emotionally. It could create the wound and not quite figure out what to do with it. The emotional consequence was real. The reckoning with that consequence was shallow. Section 6, 420. The marijuana episode and the government that banned an animated show. The episode 420 aired on the 19th of April 2009, a date chosen with obvious deliberate intent. It was the 12th episode of Season 7, written by Patrick Megan and directed by Julius Wu. The central premise involves Brian getting arrested for marijuana possession and subsequently campaigning to legalize the substance, eventually succeeding, before being persuaded to reverse course when Lois's wealthy father, Carter Pewterschmidt, offers to publish Brian's long-gestating novel in exchange for Brian promoting recriminalization. Brian abandons his principles immediately, rebans marijuana, and his novel turns out to be a catastrophic failure, selling 0 copies. The musical centerpiece is A Bag of Weed, performed by Brian and Stewie to the melody of Me Ol' Bamboo from the 1968 film Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. The song is exuberant, specific, and enthusiastically pro-marijuana in a way that leaves no room for ambiguity about which side of the debate it is occupying. It became one of the most genuinely catchy musical numbers the show ever produced, which would become relevant when the Venezuelan government turned its attention to the episode. The episode aired to 7.4 million American homes. Critics placed it among the stronger episodes of the 7th season, and the Parents Television Council raised objections during a rerun, as was their standard practice with anything Family Guy produced. None of this generated exceptional attention. Then, on the 25th of September 2009, roughly 5 months after the American premiere, Venezuelan Justice Minister Tarek El Aissami held a public press conference. He formally criticized the episode, framing it as American propaganda designed to undermine Latin American drug policies. He specifically cited the Bag of Weed musical number as advocacy for drug consumption. In response, the Venezuelan government directed private television stations to cease all broadcasts of Family Guy entirely. The cable station Venevisión was threatened with financial penalties for continuing to air the show. The ban was implemented under President Hugo Chávez's administration, which had developed a comprehensive policy framework for resisting what it characterized as American cultural imperialism. This is, by almost any measure, an extraordinary overreaction to an animated sitcom. The idea that a cartoon dog singing a cheerful song about marijuana constitutes geopolitical propaganda requires a very specific ideological frame to seem plausible. But within the context of the Chávez administration's broader cultural policies and its fraught relationship with American media, the episode fit into a pre-existing narrative about U.S. cultural influence. What the Venezuelan response paradoxically illuminates is something real about the episode's strengths. A piece of entertainment that produces no response has said nothing significant. 420. Provoked a governmental response from a foreign nation. That fact alone tells you the episode communicated something clearly enough to be understood as a position, even if the specific position the Venezuelan government thought it was taking was considerably more straightforward than what the episode was actually doing. Because 420 is not a simple pro-marijuana episode, it is an episode about the way money compromises political conviction. Brian campaigns with genuine principle, succeeds, and then immediately abandons those principles the moment something he personally wants the publication of his novel is put on the table. The Bag of Weed number, taken in context, is the high-water mark of a campaign that the episode systematically undercuts. Brian's reversal is shown as total, immediate, and shameful. His novel's catastrophic failure is the universe punishing him for his hypocrisy. The Venezuelan government never saw this arc because political censors rarely engage with the full 22 minutes before issuing condemnations. But for anyone watching the complete episode, the satirical target was always Brian's ethical cowardice rather than marijuana itself. The episode has aged reasonably well, as marijuana legalization has become a mainstream policy position across many American states. It continues to be cited as one of the stronger episodes of the 7th season, and the Venezuelan ban has settled into the show's history as one of those genuinely extraordinary facts that sounds made up when described, but is simply what happened. Section 7, PTV. The episode born from institutional rage. Every so often, a piece of television is made not from enthusiasm or creative inspiration, but from pure anger. PTV is one of those pieces of television. MacFarlane did not disguise this when he was asked about the episode's origins. His response was immediate and without qualification. In the case of PTV, it came out of rage. Rage over all the crap we have to deal with since Janet Jackson showed her boob. The reference is to the Super Bowl XXX The Eat halftime show on the 1st of February 2004, during which a performance concluded with a brief exposure of Janet Jackson's breast seen by approximately 90 million viewers in real time. The FCC received around 500,000 complaints, a number later revealed to have been substantially inflated by organized campaigns from advocacy groups filing automated submissions. The FCC responded by dramatically tightening broadcast indecency standards and raising potential fines from around $27,500 per incident to $550,000. For Family Guy, which had already attracted FCC scrutiny and been placed repeatedly on the PTC's worst shows list, this meant Fox's internal censors became significantly more aggressive. The writing staff was increasingly navigating restrictions that had shifted in a short period of time, and the anger about those restrictions had nowhere to go except into the show itself. PTV aired on the 6th of November, 2005, written by Alex Sulkin and Wellesley Wild, and directed by Dan Povenmire. The episode begins with a wardrobe malfunction at an Emmy Awards ceremony, triggering FCC censorship that escalates from restricting broadcast content to censoring the everyday lives of ordinary citizens. Peter creates a television channel called PTV, broadcast from the Griffin home, that airs uncensored content. Lois, genuinely concerned about the impact on children, calls the FCC. The escalation becomes increasingly absurdist until the FCC is censoring the sound of a dog barking and the visible skin of a kneecap. The episode's musical centerpiece is The Freakin' FCC, performed by Peter, Stewie, and Brian in matching lingerie, all three voices performed by MacFarlane himself, singing in 3 entirely different character registers simultaneously. It is a technically impressive production moment, and it functions as a genuine argument that the censors had overcorrected and that the overcorrection was more damaging to creative expression than the original offense that triggered it. The episode also included a sequence that functioned as an accountability document moments from previous Family Guy episodes that had been cut before broadcast by Fox's internal standards department. This was an extraordinary gesture. The show was saying explicitly and publicly, here are the things we made that your network prevented you from seeing. Here is the evidence of the constraint we have been working under. A documentary insertion inside a comedy episode. The PTC launched an organized campaign encouraging its members to file FCC complaints about PTV specifically, targeting the episode during November sweeps. The irony in episodes satirizing censorship generating organized campaigns to have it censored was not lost on observers. The FCC ultimately took no significant enforcement action, partly because the satirical framing complicated any straightforward indecency determination. PTV is the episode where Family Guy was most articulately argumentative, where it deployed its gifts not in service of transgression for its own sake, but in defense of a genuine principle. The episode is not arguing that there should be no limits on broadcast content. Lois's concern about children is treated as legitimate within the episode's logic. The argument is that the specific restrictions imposed after the Super Bowl controversy were disproportionate, politically driven by advocacy organizations with specific cultural agendas, and administered by a regulatory body more interested in responding to those organizations' pressure than in any coherent principle about what actually harms children. The show was not wrong about this. The FCC's post-2004 enforcement was widely criticized by First Amendment scholars and media law experts as exceeding the agency's constitutional mandate. The inflation of the complaint numbers through automated advocacy group campaigns had created a false impression of public outrage that the FCC responded to as though genuine. PTV remains one of the sharpest pieces of institutional satire that American animated comedy has ever produced. And it is the episode where the controversy the show generated was most clearly and deliberately the point. The controversy was the argument. Section 8. Not all dogs go to heaven, arguing for atheism by accident. Not All Dogs Go to Heaven aired on the 29th of March 2009 as the 11th episode of Season 7. Written by Danny Smith and directed by Greg Colton, it was an attempt to dramatize the social consequences of non-belief through Brian's experience of being publicly identified as an atheist in a community that responds with organized persecution. Seth MacFarlane is publicly and vocally atheist, and the episode bears the marks of personal investment. Meg contracts mumps at a Star Trek convention, a setup that also allows Stewie to successfully teleport the actual cast of Star Trek The Next Generation, including Patrick Stewart, Michael Dorn, LeVar Burton, and Will Wheaton, in a completely separate subplot that is significantly more charming than anything in the episode's main narrative. While bedridden, Meg watches a religious television channel featuring Kirk Cameron and becomes a born-again Christian. She begins evangelizing, targets Brian, and when his atheism becomes public, the community responds by effectively banishing him from public life. The specific images the episode uses to illustrate the community's response are extreme to the point of self-parody. A television news segment labels Brian as worse than Hitler. He is physically confronted in public. The entire town unites around its hostility with a totality that does not accurately reflect how social discrimination against atheists works in American life, where it is real and documented, but does not typically take the form of a coordinated municipal expulsion campaign. The extremity is meant to be satirical, but because it is so total and so uniform, it ends up feeling less like satire and more like a caricature of religious communities serving the episode's preferred conclusion. Brian's eventual response to Meg's pressure contains the episode's most philosophically interesting moment and its most interpersonally cruel one simultaneously. He tells Meg that her faith is understandable given how miserable her life is, but that the misery of her life does not constitute evidence for the existence of God. This is philosophically sound. The distinction between this belief helps you cope and this belief is true is a real and important distinction. But Brian delivers it not as a gentle observation, but as a demolition of Meg's personal circumstances, using the specific details of her suffering as ammunition against her faith. It is spectacularly unkind as a way to talk to someone, regardless of its philosophical validity. McFarlane acknowledged the problems in the DVD commentary, saying the writing team had genuinely tried to be balanced and that several writers with religious backgrounds had been involved in shaping the episode. He maintained that the intention was never to mock faith itself, but to critique the persecution of non-believers. He also said he regretted how heavy-handed the final product came across. These regrets, which are genuine, do not change what the episode communicates. The failure of "Not All Dogs Go to Heaven" is the failure mode of using comedy to argue for a position without genuinely engaging with what would be required to make that argument well. To dramatize religious intolerance effectively, you need to portray what genuine, thoughtful religious faith actually looks like in people who are not persecutors. The episode does not do this. Its believers are essentially a mob. A story in which one side is a mob will tend, regardless of intent, to make the case for the other side through default rather than through argument. The episode wanted to argue for tolerance of atheism. What it actually produced was an argument for atheism by making religious belief look uniformly irrational and cruel. Section 9. Quagmire's Dad, Good Intentions, and 30 Seconds That Defined Everything. Quagmire's Dad was the 18th episode of Season 8, written by Tom Devaney and directed by Pete Michels. It aired on the 9th of May, 2010. 2 months before it aired, McFarlane told the LGBTQ media website AfterElton.com that an upcoming episode would feature a transgender character and would handle the subject sympathetically. This pre-release characterization would come back to haunt the episode. The setup is that Glenn Quagmire's father, Dan, a decorated Navy veteran whom Quagmire has idealized throughout his life, comes to visit and reveals that she is a woman. She is about to have gender-affirming surgery and will subsequently be known as Ida Davis. The episode follows Quagmire's movement from rejection and revulsion towards something approaching acceptance, anchored by a hospital scene following Ida's surgery, in which Quagmire sees his parents' contentment and begins to understand what the transition meant. The writing allows this evolution to feel genuinely earned. McFarlane's voice performance in that hospital scene brings something real to it. That is the part of the episode that works. The part that does not work involves Brian. Brian has been away, returns without knowledge of Ida's transition, finds her attractive, and has a sexual encounter with her. When Brian subsequently learns the full situation that he has slept with a trans woman who is also Quagmire's father, his reaction is prolonged, graphic vomiting. Multiple critical analyses timed the sequence at approximately 30 seconds. Multiple reviewers describe the result as a large puddle on the floor. The scene is sustained and deliberately extended. Whatever the writers intended by this scene, and the most charitable reading is that Brian's revulsion was directed at the specific identity of the person, his best friend's father, rather than at Ida's. Gender identity, specifically the execution, delivers a single, clear visual message that cannot be argued away through authorial intent. A trans woman's identity is something that provokes prolonged physical disgust. That message is harmful regardless of the surrounding episode's intentions or the sincerity of those intentions. GLAAD issued criticism, citing the episode as a mishandling of transgender identity. The PTC also objected, though from a different direction. They focused on the explicit dialogue about post-operative anatomy and other sexual content. The response from transgender viewers and advocates was largely critical, with the vomiting scene cited consistently as the moment the episode failed most completely. McFarlane addressed the episode in a later interview with The Hollywood Reporter, saying he had no significant regrets and that greater nuance was the area for potential improvement rather than structural change. He was proud of Quagmire's arc. He did not address the vomiting scene directly. Ida appeared in multiple subsequent episodes, and her characterization evolved with more care over time. Later appearances gave her greater dignity and a more complex relationship with her son. But introductions establish character, and the introduction in Quagmire's Dad left a mark that later appearances could not fully erase. The episode's failure is a failure of specific execution rather than of general intent. Good intentions and genuine sympathy for transgender people in the abstract did not prevent the episode from producing a scene that communicated something harmful about transgender women. This proves that intention does not determine effect, and that reaching for something important without adequate understanding of the subject produces outcomes that the reach itself cannot mitigate. Section 10. Extra-large medium Sarah Palin, Down syndrome, and the response nobody saw coming. Extra-large medium aired on the 14th of February 2010. Valentine's Day as the 12th episode of Season 8. Written by Steve Callahan and directed by John Holmquist, the episode contains two separate storylines. One of them generated one of the more memorable pieces of public pushback in Family Guy history, coming from a direction nobody had anticipated. The A-plot follows Peter, who becomes convinced he has psychic abilities and establishes a fraudulent business exploiting grieving people. The episode's stance is explicit. A pre-credits note characterizes psychics as frauds, and the satirical target is the specific exploitation of vulnerable people's grief for profit. It is a sharper piece of satire than the episode typically gets credit for. The B-plot involves Chris developing romantic feelings for a girl named Ellen, voiced by actress Andrea Faye Friedman. Ellen has Down syndrome. The episode follows their first date at a restaurant. Where Ellen's personality proves aggressive and somewhat domineering, she slaps Chris, berates him for perceived failures, and puts him in a series of uncomfortable situations that subvert the conventional, inspirational figure portrayal of characters with disabilities. During the date, Chris asks about her family. Her father is an accountant, she tells him. Her mother is the former governor of Alaska, Sarah Palin, who served as governor of Alaska from 2006 to 2009 and was the Republican vice presidential nominee in 2008, has a son named Trig who has Down syndrome. The implication was immediate and unambiguous. Palin issued a public statement calling the episode cruel and characterizing it as a mockery of her son. Her daughter Bristol also commented publicly. The story was covered extensively on Fox News, where Palin was a contributor, which amplified it considerably. What Palin and the coverage of her response did not account for was Andrea Faye Friedman. Friedman, who had voiced Ellen and who herself has Down syndrome, sent a statement to multiple news organizations that became one of the most widely quoted pieces of communication to emerge from any Family Guy controversy. She said she had found the line about the former governor of Alaska funny, and that the word for what the show was doing was sarcasm. She described being raised to have a sense of humor and to live a normal life. And then she delivered the line that dominated all subsequent coverage. She noted that her mother had not carried her around under her arm like a loaf of French bread, the way she had seen Palin carrying Trig at public appearances. The specificity of the French bread image was immediately famous. It shifted the story entirely from a question of whether Family Guy had mocked a disabled child to a much more complicated discussion about who actually has the authority to characterize what is and is not acceptable in the representation of Down syndrome, and whether a politician's use of her child's disability as a visible presence at political events was itself a form of exploitation that the show was legitimately satirizing. MacFarlane confirmed in a subsequent Larry King Live appearance that the line was intended as political commentary on Palin specifically, and defended it as within the legitimate scope of satire about public figures. The episode was nominated for a Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Original Music and Lyrics for the song Down Syndrome Girl, which depicts Ellen as beautiful and desirable in an explicit pushback against cultural tendencies to see Down syndrome as primarily a tragedy. The Emmy nomination was institutional validation for the episode's genuine accomplishments. The fundamental distinction the Palin controversy missed is the difference between mocking a group of people and mocking a politician's specific behavior toward a member of that group. The episode's treatment of Ellen giving her personality, agency, edge, and an actress with Down syndrome to voice her was considerably more respectful than Palin's characterization allowed. The controversial line was a jab at a politician. The character around that line was something more interesting and more humanizing. Section 11. When You Wish Upon a Weinstein shelved for 4 years. When You Wish Upon a Weinstein was produced in 2000 as what was intended to be the Season 2 finale. Written by Ricky Blitt and directed by Dan Povenmire, it was completed and then shelved by Fox for nearly 4 years over concerns that the content might be perceived as anti-Semitic. The plot involves Peter losing money to a scammer selling volcano insurance, entirely useless in Rhode Island, and turning to the stereotype that Jewish people are particularly skilled at financial management as a guide to recovering his losses. A Jewish accountant named Max Weinstein appears fortuitously. Peter credits this to divine intervention, and the episode eventually follows Peter's decision to have his son Chris convert to Judaism through a bar mitzvah, reasoning that if Jewish people are better with money, being Jewish will give Chris an advantage in life. The episode includes a song called I Need a Jew, sung to the melody of When You Wish Upon a Star from the 1940 Disney film Pinocchio. The DVD version contains a lyric referencing the historical claim that Jewish people killed Christ. The broadcast version changed this lyric to have Peter explicitly deny the claim. The distinction between the two versions is itself informative about how differently the episode was calibrated for different contexts. Fox held the episode unreleased for 3 years. The Season 2 DVD included it in September 2003. Adult Swim aired it in November 2003. Fox broadcast a modified version in December 2004, nearly 4 years after production. MacFarlane recorded a brief introduction for the Adult Swim broadcast, describing it with obvious dry amusement as the episode that Fox refused to air because they felt it was too risky. The central question the episode raises is whether its satirical intent successfully neutralizes the harmful potential of the stereotypes it deploys. The satirical target is clearly Peter and his uncritical acceptance of cultural stereotypes. He is shown as ridiculous for using stereotypes as practical guidance, and Max Weinstein is depicted as intelligent, capable, and genuinely helpful. The humor comes from Peter's naivete rather than from the stereotypes themselves being presented as accurate. But satire that uses harmful stereotypes as raw material requires the audience to make a specific interpretive move to recognize that what is being presented is being mocked rather than endorsed. Not all audiences make that move. And with stereotypes that carry specific historical weight, the failure of that interpretive move can have consequences that outlast the joke. The episode was additionally subject to an intellectual property lawsuit. Born Co., which held the rights to When You Wish Upon a Star, sued Fox in 2007, arguing that I Need a Jew was not genuine parody, which is protected under U.S. copyright law but copyright infringement. The lawsuit was resolved in Fox's favor in 2009, with the court finding the song qualified as parody. The 4-year legal battle added yet another layer to an episode that had already accumulated more controversy than any other in the show's early history. The episode now sits as a normalized part of the Family Guy catalog available on streaming, discussed in the show's history without the level of ongoing controversy that surrounds later episodes. Whether this normalization represents genuine resolution of the questions it raised, or simply the passage of time reducing their urgency, is itself worth considering. Section 12. Life of Brian Death as a Marketing Strategy. Season 12 of Family Guy aired from 2013 to 2014. By this point, the show's ratings had been declining steadily for years. It was averaging somewhere between 3 and 4 million viewers per week, a significant fall from the 7 to 8 million the revival had achieved. The creative team was aware that something was needed to remind the audience the show still had the capacity to generate genuine surprise. Life of Brian was the 6th episode of Season 12, airing on the 24th of November 2013. The episode begins with Stewie destroying his time machine, a piece of narrative housekeeping that is obviously establishing something without revealing what. Then, in the final act, Brian and Stewie are playing street hockey in front of the house. A car comes around the corner. Brian is struck. He is badly injured. He is rushed to a veterinary hospital. He does not survive. The episode treated the death with genuine emotional investment. The Griffin family's grief was handled seriously. Stewie's devastation was particularly intense. His friendship with Brian had been, across several seasons, the most consistently emotionally interesting relationship in the show, and the writing allowed the loss to carry weight. The voice performances were thoughtful. The episode was making a genuine effort. By the following week, the family had adopted a new dog named Vinny, voiced by Tony Sirico of The Sopranos. Vinny was positioned not as a temporary substitute but as an actual new character, genuinely occupying the space Brian had left. The show was committing to its choice. The internet's response was one of the larger cultural events the show had generated in years. A petition demanding Brian's return gathered more than 100,000 signatures within days. Social media covered the death extensively. National news organizations ran the story with the seriousness reserved for actual public figures. The show was trending everywhere. 2 episodes later, in Christmas Guy, Stewie used a time travel device obtained from a future version of himself to go back to the moment before the accident and save Brian's life. Brian came back. Vinny was gone. Everything was restored. MacFarlane addressed the fan reaction at a Television Critics Association press conference. He said the response had surprised him, in a good way, because it demonstrated that people still cared about the character. He confirmed that the stunt had done what it was designed to do. It had reminded audiences that the show was still capable of things they did not expect. He subsequently posted on social media noting that fans surely had not believed Brian was gone forever, adding that permanently killing Brian would have required the writers to be in a significantly altered mental state. The honesty of this account is remarkable. McFarlane confirmed, "The death was designed to generate a specific reaction. The permanence was always false. The resurrection was always planned, timed for the Christmas episode to maximize emotional impact." He confirmed that the audience's genuine emotional investment in a character had been deliberately exploited for commercial purposes. The episode sits at 4.7 out of 10 on IMDb, among the lowest ratings in the show's history. Fans consistently rank it among the worst episodes ever produced. The AV Club, notably, gave it an A-, the highest grade of any Season 12 episode, but critical and audience responses have diverged almost completely on this one. The specific nature of the controversy around Life of Brian is distinct from every other episode discussed tonight. When Family Guy was controversial because of what it said about abortion or domestic violence or transgender identity, the controversy arose from genuine engagement with real subjects, however imperfect. The show was doing something. When Family Guy was controversial because it killed and quickly resurrected Brian, the controversy arose from the show treating its audience's genuine emotional investment as a resource to be harvested temporarily and returned when the harvest was complete. This is the specific kind of cynicism that audiences have an instinctive ability to recognize, even before they can articulate it precisely. A show that surprises its audience is doing something real. A show that simulates surprise for commercial purposes is doing something that the audience will eventually identify as hollow, regardless of how well executed the simulation is. Brian's death was executed well, emotionally. It was still hollow at its core. And McFarlane's subsequent confirmation of that hollowness, offered apparently without embarrassment, was its own kind of statement about where the show had arrived after 12 seasons. Section 13. The pattern, the legacy, and what it all means. We have covered 12 major controversies spanning from the show's earliest seasons through to its 12th season, an episode America never officially saw, episodes that drew fire from foreign governments and domestic advocacy groups, episodes that generated Emmy nominations alongside FCC complaints, episodes that tried to say something meaningful and failed, an episode that manufactured meaning for commercial purposes and then admitted it openly afterward. What connects all of these controversies? What do they collectively tell us about Family Guy, about American broadcast culture, and about the specific space that adult animated comedy occupies in our media landscape? The first thing they tell us is that Family Guy's controversies were not random. They were the product of a show actively pushing against limits of taste, of political sensitivity, of what broadcast television would address directly. Some of those limits were worth pushing against. The FCC controversy that produced PTV was a genuine fight about creative freedom with real stakes and a coherent argument. Partial Terms of Endearment was a legitimate attempt to engage with a subject American media culture was too frightened to address openly. Extra Large Medium ended up being defended by the community, a politician claimed to be protecting on their behalf. The second thing these controversies tell us is that the show's relationship with cultural sensitivity was always more complicated than either its enthusiastic defenders or its most aggressive critics wanted to acknowledge. Family Guy was not a show that hated everyone equally. It was made by people with real political convictions and real aesthetic priorities, but it was also a show that sometimes prioritized the transgression over the thought, the joke over the understanding, the controversy over the substance. The episodes that failed did so because the writers reached for something real without quite knowing enough about what they were reaching for. The third thing these controversies reveal is about the audience. Every reaction we have discussed was generated by people who cared about something about reproductive rights, about domestic violence, about transgender representation, about the nature of religious faith, about the integrity of storytelling, about a cartoon dog who drank martinis and occasionally showed genuine feeling. The intensity of those reactions is evidence that the show touched things that mattered to people, which is itself a form of power. A show that provokes nothing has said, nothing that anyone needed to hear. Family Guy, at its most controversial, was at least saying things that mattered enough to provoke. The fourth thing these controversies tell us is about the specific constraints and pressure points of American broadcast culture. The history of what Family Guy was and was not allowed to say, when it was allowed, and what happened when it pushed anyway, is a cultural document. Partial Terms of Endearment tells you where the American media landscape was in 2010. 420 tells you something about the political dynamics between the United States and Venezuela under a specific government. PTV tells you something about the consequences of regulatory overcorrection following a celebrity wardrobe malfunction. Each controversy is embedded in its specific moment, in ways that reward attention. The fifth and perhaps most important thing these controversies tell us is about the difference between controversy that matters and controversy that does not. The difference is whether the show is genuinely trying to engage with something real or manufacturing outrage as a strategy. Partial Terms of Endearment was genuine, it was trying to do something ambitious and was prevented. Life of Brian was a simulation engineered to appear ambitious while being entirely temporary and safe. The audience proved perfectly capable of distinguishing between the two. Family Guy has been on the air for over 25 years. It has generated more controversy than almost any other animated show in American television history, and it has survived every controversy it generated. Some of that survival reflects genuine creative resilience in the show's best seasons. Some reflects the commercial logic that keeps it financially viable regardless of critical standing, cheap to produce, enormously valuable in reruns and streaming, and a brand that generates merchandise revenue that makes the business case solid, independent of any given episode's reception. And some reflects the deep affection that a generation of viewers formed for these characters during the show's golden years, an affection that persists even through the disappointments. The controversies are not separate from Family Guy's story. They are the story. They are where the show made its most revealing choices, where its values and its failures were most visible, and where the gap between what it was capable of and what it sometimes chose to do was most clearly defined. Understanding those controversies, in detail and in context, is one of the best ways to understand what this show actually was, and what, at its most ambitious, it was genuinely trying to become. A show can go wrong in many ways, and Family Guy went wrong in most of them at various points across its run. But the episodes we have discussed tonight are not simply the show at its worst. Several of them are the show at its most interesting, its most willing to reach for something that actually matters. The reaching is worth examining. The places where it reached and fell short tell you as much about the difficulty of what it was attempting as they do about the limitations of the attempt. The places where it reached and was stopped where an entire network decided the conversation was too large to have tell you something real and worth knowing about the culture that contained it. That is the nature of controversial television. It is never just about what a show was willing to say. It is about what the culture was willing to hear. And sometimes those two things are not the same, and the distance between them is where the most interesting conversations live. If this video gave you something to think about, whether you agree with the analysis, want to push back on something, or just want to share a memory of first watching one of these episodes, drop it in the comments. If you are watching this in the middle of the night with headphones in, or on a long drive, or settling in for a relaxed evening, I am glad you are here. This is the kind of long-form content that only survives if the people who find value in it stick around, and your subscription genuinely makes a difference. Thanks for spending a few hours here tonight. Appendix section. The broader history of what Family Guy chose to fight about. To fully understand the controversies we have already walked through tonight, it helps to step back and look at the larger pattern of what the show chose to engage with across its run, and more importantly, what it chose not to engage with. Because the list of things Family Guy was willing to satirize is long and in many places genuinely admirable, but the list of things it avoided, the subjects it treated gingerly or not at all, is equally revealing. The show was always willing to satirize American politics in the broad sense. Politicians from both parties appeared in episodes, were mocked in cutaway gags, and served as targets for jokes ranging from mild to genuinely pointed. The show's political satire was, in its better seasons, relatively even-handed. It was willing to make fun of conservative politicians and liberal ones, of religious right figures and secular left ones, of anyone who offered a sufficiently large target. The 420 episode is a good example of this kind of even-handedness. The episode is clearly sympathetic to marijuana legalization, but the character who campaigns for it immediately abandons his principles for personal gain, which is a critique of the progressive figure at the center of the story rather than an endorsement of him. The show was consistently willing to engage with religious topics, usually from a skeptical or atheist perspective, though with varying degrees of success. The Not All Dogs Go to Heaven episode we discussed earlier represents the failure mode of this engagement. But there were other episodes that handled religious satire more deftly, episodes that made jokes about faith without making those jokes into arguments that faith itself is what stupid or weak people cling to. The early seasons in particular had a lighter touch with religious content that the later seasons would lose as MacFarlane's own publicly stated, atheism became more centrally expressed through the show's voice. The show was willing to engage with race in ways that were sometimes sharp and sometimes clumsy. The Cleveland Brown character was, throughout his run on Family Guy, a largely benevolent but sometimes problematic figure. Benevolent in the sense that Cleveland was generally treated with more dignity than some other characters. Problematic in the sense that his characterization often reduced him to his mildness and his long-suffering patience in ways that felt less like characterization and more like stereotype management. The Cleveland Loretta Quagmire episode we discussed is the clearest example of the show creating a racial dynamic and then failing to engage with it. But there were also moments scattered through the show's run where racial satire was more successful episodes that made genuine points about American racism by showing how Peter's obliviousness manifested in racial contexts, or how the show's fictional city of Quahog reflected real patterns of American social segregation. What the show was consistently unwilling to engage with, at least in any sustained or serious way, was class. Family Guy is set in a working-class environment. Peter works at a brewery. The family lives in a middle-class neighborhood. The social world of the show is defined by the local bar and the suburban street and the kinds of small economic anxieties that characterize working-class American life. But the show rarely engaged with the economic structures that create and maintain that class position. The jokes about money were almost always individual. Peter made a bad financial decision, or Peter was jealous of someone with more money, or Peter briefly came into money and immediately lost it rather than structural. The show was not interested in the systems that kept the Griffins where they were. This is worth noting because it marks a significant point of contrast with The Simpsons, which Family Guy was frequently and unfavorably compared to in its early years. The Simpsons was, across its best seasons, genuinely interested in the economic conditions of its characters' lives. Homer's working-class status was not just a premise but a genuine subject. The show explored what it meant to work a dangerous job for inadequate pay, what it felt like to be undereducated in a world that increasingly rewards education, what the texture of genuine economic anxiety looked like from the inside. Family Guy acknowledged the same economic conditions and then used them as backdrop rather than as subject matter. This is not a criticism so much as an observation about the kind of show Family Guy chose to be. Its satirical energy was directed outward at politicians, at celebrities, at cultural institutions rather than inward at the structural conditions of its characters' lives. The show was very good at making jokes about the world beyond Quahog and less interested in the world within it. The controversies we have discussed tonight all involve the show reaching beyond itself towards subjects of genuine social weight. The ones that succeeded did so because the reach was accompanied by real thought. The ones that failed did so because the reach exceeded the preparation, because the Parents Television Council and the war that made Family Guy famous. It would be incomplete to discuss Family Guy's controversial history without spending some time on the organization that fought the show most aggressively and most publicly across its run, the Parents Television Council. The PTC was founded in 1995 by L. Brent Bozell III and is a conservative media watchdog organization dedicated to what it characterizes as the protection of children from inappropriate content in entertainment media. Over the years, it has targeted dozens of television programs, organized boycott campaigns against advertisers, and filed thousands of formal complaints with the FCC. Family Guy became one of the PTC's primary targets almost from the moment the show premiered in 1999. The organization placed the show on its worst primetime programs list 3 separate times, in 2000, in 2005, and in 2006. It filed multiple formal complaints with the FCC about specific episodes, organized campaigns encouraging its members to contact Fox advertisers, and produced detailed analyses of Family Guy episodes cataloging content it considered inappropriate. The relationship between Family Guy and the PTC was adversarial in a way that the show eventually made explicit in its content. McFarlane has been quoted comparing the PTC to hate mail from Hitler, which is an extreme characterization, but one that gives you a sense of how the creative team felt about the organization's interference. The PTV episode was, as we discussed, directly inspired by the PTC's post-Super Bowl campaign to tighten broadcast indecency standards and was structured partly as an extended argument against the PTC's right to use regulatory pressure to shape broadcast content. The PTC's complaints about Family Guy focused primarily on three categories of content: sexual material, including jokes about anatomy and sexual behavior; violence, including both cartoon slapstick and more graphic content that appeared in later seasons; and what the organization characterized as disrespect for religious values. Their complaints about specific episodes varied in their sophistication. Some were carefully documented analyses of specific content, others were more general expressions of disapproval. The FCC acted on some of these complaints and declined to act on others, with the threshold for formal enforcement shifting considerably over the years as the regulatory environment around broadcast content changed. What the PTC's war against Family Guy accomplished, paradoxically, was to help establish the show's cultural identity as something transgressive and worth paying attention to. In the media environment of the early 2000s, being targeted by the PTC was itself a form of credibility for a certain kind of audience. It signaled that the show was doing something that the forces of conventional respectability found threatening. The PTC's campaigns attracted news coverage. The news coverage brought audience attention. Some of that audience turned into viewers who had not previously watched the show. The controversy, in a very real sense, was advertising. This dynamic was not unique to Family Guy. South Park had benefited from similar attention in its earlier years, and both Married with Children and NYPD Blue had seen viewership spikes following organized campaigns against their content. The PTC understood this and occasionally discussed the paradox of how attacking programs they disapproved of could inadvertently increase those programs' cultural profiles. But they pressed on anyway, because the alternative silence in the face of content they found harmful was not acceptable within their organizational mission. The interesting question, looking back at the PTC's campaign against Family Guy across its first decade, is whether their concerns were ever genuinely justified, or whether they were always primarily a form of cultural conservatism defending its territory against comedic transgression. The answer, based on what we have discussed tonight, is that it is more complicated than either side wanted to acknowledge. Some of what the PTC was concerned about the treatment of Meg, certain graphically violent content in the later seasons, the Screams of Silence episode's handling of domestic violence, was content that deserved scrutiny and criticism from a perspective that had nothing to do with conservative cultural politics. Other things the PTC objected to: the abortion episode, the atheism episode, the drug legalization episode were content where their objections were primarily political and where the show was doing something legitimate, even if imperfectly. The difficulty is that the PTC's framework did not make this distinction. They objected to content that was genuinely problematic and content that was merely politically inconvenient, using the same vocabulary and the same regulatory mechanisms. This made it impossible to take their specific objections seriously as criticism, even when the specific content they were objecting to deserved to be examined critically. They cried wolf so often and so loudly that when there was something worth noting, the alarm had already been tuned out. The question of what animated comedy is allowed to do. Threading through all of the controversies we have discussed tonight is a larger question that the controversies themselves never fully answer. What is animated comedy actually allowed to do? What subjects can it address? How dark can it get? What purposes does it serve that justify the discomfort and the offense it sometimes generates? These are not simple questions, and honest engagement with them produces genuinely complicated answers. The case for allowing animated comedy to go wherever it wants to go is strong. Comedy has historically been one of the primary mechanisms through which cultures process things they cannot otherwise talk about directly. Court jesters were allowed to say things to kings that counselors and advisors could not. Political satirists have mocked the powerful when direct criticism would have been dangerous. Dark humor allows people to approach painful subjects, death, illness, trauma, loss obliquely, from an angle that makes engagement possible when direct approach would be overwhelming. Animated comedy specifically has a particular freedom that live-action comedy does not always have, which is the freedom of obvious unreality. When you are watching animated characters, You are always aware on some level that what you are watching is not real, that the violence is not real, that the people doing and saying these things do not exist. This protective layer of unreality allows animated comedy to explore darker territory than would be comfortable in live action. A cartoon character being hit by a car and dying is different from a live-action character being hit by a car and dying, even if the emotional manipulation involved is similar. The cartoon frame creates a distance that makes engagement possible. Family Guy used this freedom extensively and, in its best moments, productively. Some of the show's most genuinely funny moments came from going places that live-action comedy could not go, places where the absurdity was so extreme that it was only possible in animation, where the darkness was so complete that it could only be safely accessed through the filter of a cartoon frame. But the protective layer of animated unreality has limits. It does not make every subject appropriate for comedy regardless of how it is handled. The argument that it is only a cartoon, which was used repeatedly by the show's defenders when specific episodes generated criticism, is not a complete defense. A cartoon can communicate harmful ideas. A cartoon can reinforce damaging stereotypes. A cartoon can exploit real people's suffering for entertainment in ways that cause genuine harm, even if the medium doing the exploiting is inherently artificial. The most honest position is that animated comedy is allowed to do a great deal more than critics on one side of the argument usually want to acknowledge, but not quite everything, and that the things it is not allowed to do are defined not by the subject matter, but by the care and the understanding brought to that subject matter. Partial terms of endearment deserve to air. Screams of silence deserve the criticism it received. The distinction between them is not about the seriousness of the subject matter, but about whether the handling of that subject matter reflected genuine thought and genuine understanding. This distinction is not always easy to draw in advance. The Quagmire's Dad episode was described by its creator before it aired as a sympathetic portrayal of transgender experience, and within its overall structure it was trying to be that. The 30-second vomiting sequence was not an act of malice. It was a choice made without sufficient understanding of what it would communicate. The failure was not of intent but of knowledge and care. Better preparation would have produced a better episode. The preparation was inadequate. The episode reflected that inadequacy. That is perhaps the most honest lesson that Family Guy's controversial history offers. Not that animated comedy should avoid difficult subjects, it should not. And the episodes that tried to do something real with difficult subjects are among the most interesting things the show ever produced. But that engaging with difficult subjects requires preparation proportional to their difficulty. The shows that manage this, BoJack Horseman handling addiction and depression and abortion with care and intelligence, BoJack Horseman being perhaps the most extreme example of how far animated comedy can go when the preparation is adequate, demonstrate what is possible when the ambition is matched by the work. Family Guy, across its controversial history, was more ambitious than it was prepared. It reached further than it had done the work to reach, and the controversies that resulted were the gap between the reach and the preparation made visible, sometimes in ways that were ultimately productive, and sometimes in ways that caused harm that the creative team did not intend, and the show never fully reckoned with. The cultural legacy and what comes after. By the time Family Guy reached its 20th season, the landscape of television comedy had changed almost beyond recognition from the one the show had entered in 1999. Streaming platforms had expanded what was possible in adult animation. Shows like Big Mouth, BoJack Horseman, Tuca and Bertie, Harley Quinn, and Rick and Morty had pushed animated comedy into places that Family Guy had pointed toward but never quite reached, places of genuine psychological complexity, genuine structural innovation, and genuine care for the subjects being engaged with. This shift in the landscape made Family Guy's particular kind of transgression feel increasingly dated. The show had been doing what it did, the cutaway gags, the edgy one-liners, the deliberately offensive character moments since 1999. By the time the 23rd or 24th season was airing, the audience for adult animation had been educated by shows that did similar things with considerably more craft. The novelty of Family Guy's approach had long since evaporated. What remained was the show's familiarity, its long history, and the nostalgia of older viewers for the seasons when it had been genuinely good. The controversies we have discussed tonight are, in many ways, the most interesting document of what the show was actually trying to do across its run, more interesting, certainly, than the show's ratings trajectory, and more revealing than any analysis of its cutaway gag frequency or its character consistency scores. They show a show that was genuinely wrestling, imperfectly and inconsistently, but genuinely, with what it meant to make comedy about the world as it actually was, rather than the world as it was safe to portray. Not all of those wrestling matches produced good episodes. Several of them produced some of the worst episodes the show ever aired. But the wrestling itself was real, and the willingness to engage even clumsily, even with inadequate preparation, even in ways that sometimes caused harm, is more interesting in retrospect than a show that never tried anything worth getting wrong. The episodes that got banned tell you what American culture was afraid to discuss. The episodes that generated international incidents tell you something about how American cultural exports function as political objects in the rest of the world. The episodes that mishandled serious subjects tell you something about the limits of what the show's creative process was able to prepare for. The episodes that handled serious subjects well, and there were some, tell you what animated comedy is capable of when it takes its own ambitions seriously enough to do the work they require. And the episode that manufactured a character death for commercial purposes and then openly admitted to it tells you something about what the show had become by the time it had been on the air long enough to stop worrying about whether it was still trying. That is the arc of Family Guy's controversial history. From a show that was getting into trouble because it was genuinely reaching for something, to a show that was manufacturing the appearance of reaching while carefully ensuring it never arrived anywhere it had not already planned to go. The best episodes of the show's early seasons were controversial because they were honest. The worst episodes of its later seasons were controversial because they were calculated. The difference between those two kinds of controversy is the difference between a show that is alive and a show that is performing aliveness. Family Guy, across its 25-plus years, was both of those things at different moments. Understanding which was which and why is the work that tonight's conversation has been trying to do. A final note on the show that could have been: there is a version of Family Guy that continued past its cancellation in 2002, came back in 2005, and found a way to grow alongside the audience that had kept it alive through reruns and DVD sales. A version that took the emotional care of its best early episodes and extended it into the more ambitious subject matter it was reaching for in its middle seasons. A version that handled domestic violence the way Screams of Silence wanted to handle it and failed. A version that handled transgender identity the way Quagmire's dad wanted to handle it and fell short. A version that made the choices that would have given Meg Griffin the story she deserved, rather than the years of documented cruelty the show gave her instead. That version of the show does not exist. What exists is the version that made the choices it made. Some of them brave, some of them craven, some of them clumsy, some of them calculated, and occasionally, in the moments that justify the entire enterprise, some of them genuinely good. The controversies are the record of all of those choices, set against the reaction of a world that was paying close enough attention to have opinions. That is more than most television shows ever achieve. It is not everything a show could aspire to, but it is something real and something worth understanding. And on that note, genuinely, warmly thank you for being here. Thank you for spending this time with these ideas and this history and this strange, messy, ambitious, occasionally brilliant, and often disappointing show. Drop a comment. Tell me what you think. Tell me what I got wrong, or what I got right, or what episode you think deserved to be in here that we did not cover. These conversations are what make this channel worth making. If you are not subscribed yet, now is the time. Every subscription is what keeps this kind of long-form content viable. Thanks for tonight. Get some rest. End of script. Deep dive. The partial terms of endearment cultural context. To fully appreciate why partial terms of endearment generated the institutional response it did, you need to understand the specific cultural and political atmosphere of American television. In 2010, the year the episode was completed, and the year Fox decided not to air it. The late 2000s and early 2010s were a period of intensifying polarization in American political life. The 2008 election of Barack Obama had, paradoxically, both energized a progressive movement and catalyzed an organized conservative backlash that would eventually produce the Tea Party movement, the rise of partisan media ecosystems, and a set of cultural battles that made the phrase culture war feel newly urgent rather than quaintly nostalgic. Abortion was one of the most inflamed fronts in those battles, and had been for decades, but the specific political temperature around reproductive rights in 2010 was particularly high. The Affordable Care Act was being debated during exactly this period, and one of the most contentious dimensions of that debate concerned whether insurance coverage for abortion services would be included or excluded. The fight over the Stupak-Pitts Amendment, which sought to significantly restrict federal funding for abortion in the ACA context, was ongoing and fierce. Politicians on both sides were making statements about abortion that were generating daily news coverage. The subject was not just politically contested. It was actively present in the news cycle, in congressional chambers, in state legislatures, and in the cultural conversation in a way that made Fox's calculus about the risks of airing the episode appear, from their perspective, quite straightforward. Kevin Riley's language in his New York Times interview describing the economic moment as extremely fragile, in the same breath as he described the subject matter as extremely fragile, is revealing. He was not just worried about political controversy in the abstract. He was worried about the specific consequences of a network affiliated with Fox News, a network that had a significant audience of conservative viewers, broadcasting an episode of an animated comedy in which a female character chose to have an abortion, and the narrative presented this choice as legitimate and as hers to make. The commercial risk was real. Family Guy's advertising revenue depended on companies that did not want to be associated with political controversy of any kind, particularly controversy around abortion, which has the unusual property of generating almost equally intense opposition from both sides of the debate. A pro-life viewer who saw the episode might boycott the advertisers who sponsored it. A network executive calculating that risk had to weigh the potential revenue loss from organized advertiser boycott campaigns against whatever cultural or creative value the episode might deliver. What makes this calculus interesting in retrospect is that it underestimated how much the media landscape was about to change. Within a few years of Fox's decision not to air the episode, streaming platforms would be producing content dealing with abortion, sexual violence, addiction, and other difficult subjects with a level of explicit engagement that broadcast networks had never attempted, and doing so without triggering the kind of advertiser boycott crisis that Fox was trying to avoid. The reason streaming could go where broadcast could not was partly the pay model. Streaming subscribers are not the same kind of captive audience for advertising that broadcast viewers are, and partly the fragmentation of the media landscape itself, which meant that niche content could find niche audiences without needing to be palatable to everyone simultaneously. Partial Terms of Endearment was a broadcast episode made for a broadcast network in a moment when broadcast networks were still trying to be palatable to everyone simultaneously. That tension between the creative ambitions of the show and the commercial constraints of its distribution platform is what killed the episode in the United States. Not censorship in any formal sense. Not a government decision. Simply a business calculation by a network that looked at the commercial risks of the subject matter and concluded the risks outweighed the rewards. The episode's British premiere on BBC Three is itself illuminating. The BBC Three audience received the episode without incident. There was no organized protest, no advertiser withdrawal, no governmental complaint. The episode aired, was reviewed, was discussed, and then became a normal part of the Family Guy catalog for British viewers. The difference was not the content, which was identical. The difference was the cultural and commercial context in which the content landed. This tells you something important about the nature of the controversy around Partial Terms of Endearment. It was not a controversy about the episode itself so much as a controversy about what the American cultural and commercial landscape was capable of handling in 2010. The episode was not too dark, too offensive, or too irresponsible for American audiences. It was too politically precise for American commercial television's risk appetite in that specific moment. That the episode has remained suppressed in the United States even as the cultural landscape around abortion has continued to evolve, even as streaming platforms have produced content engaging with the subject far more directly, suggests that the suppression has by now taken on its own institutional momentum. The episode is absent because it has always been absent, and changing that absence would require someone to make an active decision to reverse a status quo that has simply persisted without requiring any ongoing justification. No one has made that decision. The episode remains invisible to American audiences through any official channel. Deep Dive. Understanding screams of silence in the context of domestic violence awareness. The specific failures of Screams of Silence. The story of Brenda Q become clearer when you understand the actual landscape of research and advocacy around domestic violence that existed at the time the episode was produced and aired. By 2011, when the episode aired, there was a substantial and well-documented body of research on intimate partner violence that was available to anyone who chose to engage with it. The National Domestic Violence Hotline had been operating since 1996 and had extensive public resources about the dynamics of abusive relationships. The concept of the cycle of violence, first described in detail by researcher Lenore Walker in her 1979 book, The Battered Woman, had been refined and extended across 3 decades of subsequent research and was widely known in academic and advocacy communities. The specific myth that the screams of silence intervention scene reinforced that victims of domestic violence simply need to be told to leave, or shown clearly that their partner's behavior is unacceptable and will then be able to act on that information, was one of the most persistently documented misconceptions in the field. Research consistently showed that the average victim of domestic violence leaves and returns to their abusive partner multiple times before making a permanent departure, not because of stupidity or weakness, but because of the complexity of the psychological, economic, and social factors involved. Each return was not a failure to understand the situation, but a navigated choice within a set of circumstances that outside observers rarely fully understood. The episode's intervention scene commits the additional error of focusing entirely on verbal argument as the mechanism of intervention. Actual domestic violence advocates, by 2011, had well-developed frameworks for what kinds of support were most and least helpful to someone in an abusive relationship. Those frameworks emphasized listening over persuading, validating the person's experience without minimizing the danger, providing practical information about resources without requiring immediate action, and maintaining contact and support through a process that might take months or years, rather than a single dramatic conversation. None of this complexity appears in Screams of Silence. The intervention is a single scene in which 3 men tell Brenda what she should do, she resists, and they are frustrated by her resistance in a way that positions her resistance as the problem rather than as an understandable response to genuinely complicated circumstances. The episode never asks and never allows the audience to ask what Brenda's life would actually look like if she left Jeff, what economic resources she has, what social support she has access to, what she fears Jeff will do if she tries to leave. These are the questions that actual domestic violence intervention has to grapple with. The episode simply does not engage with them. The resolution by murder is particularly irresponsible in this context. Research on domestic violence consistently shows that the most dangerous period for a victim is immediately following separation from an abusive partner, the period when the abuser's control over the victim is most threatened, and their potential for violence is highest. The episode's solution of simply eliminating the abuser ignores this reality entirely, and the fact that it is presented as a satisfying conclusion sends the message that the way to help someone in an abusive relationship is for a third party to take dramatic, unilateral action rather than to support the victim in accessing the resources and making the choices that their situation actually requires. The comparison with how other media has handled the same subject is not just instructive, it is a genuine indictment of the episode's preparation. Multiple episodes of Law and Order, Special Victims Unit, a procedural drama that has its own significant problems with how it handles these subjects, nonetheless managed to portray the complexity of intimate partner violence more accurately than Screams of Silence managed in the same year. Lifetime movies of the period, frequently derided as melodramatic and oversimplified, routinely depicted the cycle of violence and the difficulty of leaving with more nuance than this episode achieved. The question this raises is not why the show tried to address domestic violence. That impulse was genuinely good, but why it aired an episode about domestic violence without apparently engaging with any of the substantial material that existed on the subject. The answer is probably that the preparation for the episode was inadequate to its ambitions, and that the production process did not include consultation with people who had the relevant expertise. This is a structural problem rather than a moral one, and it is the kind of problem that better production processes can address. Shows that have handled difficult subjects well, The Wire, engaging with systemic poverty and crime, BoJack Horseman, engaging with addiction and trauma, Fleabag, engaging with grief and self-destruction, typically involved extensive research and consultation. The writers of those shows spent time with people who had lived experience of the subjects they were depicting. They read the research. They got the consultation. Screams of Silence did not visibly do any of this, and the episode reflects that absence. Deep Dive: The Seahorse Seashell Party and the Psychology of Meg's Situation. The argument Brian makes to Meg in Seahorse Seashell Party that her role as the family's punching bag is a form of selfless love that maintains the family's equilibrium has a psychological name: codependency. The specific dynamic Brian describes, in which one person absorbs the dysfunction of a system in order to keep the system functioning, is recognizable to anyone who has studied family systems theory, the branch of psychology that examines how families operate as interconnected systems rather than as collections of separate individuals. Family systems theory, developed primarily by Murray Bowen in the mid-20th century, describes what it calls the identified patient, the family member who carries the symptoms of the family's dysfunctions, who appears to be the sick or troubled one, while the rest of the family maintains the appearance of health. The identified patient is not actually the source of the family's problems. They are the container into which the family's problems are poured. Their visible dysfunction allows the other family members to avoid examining their own contributions to the dysfunctional dynamic. By this framework, Meg is the Griffin family's identified patient. She is the person who carries the family's darkness, the incompetent father, the conflicted mother, the neglected children in visible form. Her suffering makes the other family members' lives more functional by providing a constant outlet for the frustrations and insecurities they cannot otherwise process. As long as Meg is available to absorb the family's collective psychological waste, the other members can maintain the illusion of relative normalcy. This is a legitimate observation about a real and documented psychological pattern. The problem with Seahorse Seashell Party is not that it depicts this pattern depicting it as legitimate, even interesting. The problem is that it presents this pattern as something Meg should accept and participate in voluntarily, rather than as something she should seek help to change. Family systems theory does not conclude that identified patients should accept their role to preserve family equilibrium. It concludes that the role itself reflects a dysfunctional family system that all of its members need to work to change. Meg escaping the identified patient role would require the other family members to confront and address the sources of their dysfunction, which is uncomfortable, which requires work, which is genuinely difficult. The episode shows Meg choosing to spare her family that discomfort by returning to the familiar role. The episode frames this as love, and there is something that looks like love in Meg's choice. She is prioritizing others' comfort over her own well-being, which is structurally similar to self-sacrificing love. But self-sacrifice that enables others to avoid addressing their dysfunctions is not genuinely loving. It is enabling. It allows the people Meg loves to continue behaving in ways that harm her without ever having to examine why they behave that way or what it costs. A genuinely loving choice, loving toward her family as well as toward herself, would be to refuse to continue serving as the identified patient, to force the family to find other ways to manage their collective dysfunction, even though that process would be painful and difficult. The episode does not see this distinction. It presents Meg's self-sacrifice as the obviously correct choice, the loving choice, the choice that maintains the family. What it does not present, what it explicitly avoids presenting, is the question of what it would cost the other family members to stop hurting Meg, and whether they are capable of paying that cost. This is the deepest failure of Seahorse Seashell Party. Not that it depicted an abusive family dynamic, it did that accurately. Not that it showed Meg choosing to remain in that dynamic, that choice is psychologically plausible and honestly rendered. The failure is that it presented that choice as correct, as loving, as the right resolution, when the actual resolution, the one that family systems theory, psychology, and common moral sense would suggest, would be for Meg to refuse the role, and for the family to grapple with what that refusal forces them to confront. The writers of the episode clearly understood the dynamic they were depicting. The Brian speech is too accurate in its description of the identified patient role to be the product of ignorance. The failure was in the evaluation of that dynamic, in deciding that the dynamic, accurately described, should be affirmed rather than questioned. Deep Dive: The 420 episode and the history it references. Brian's speech in the 420 episode about William Randolph Hearst and the criminalization of marijuana deserves more attention than it typically receives. because it references a genuine and significant piece of American history that the show handles with more accuracy than its critics often give it credit for. The criminalization of marijuana in the United States in the 1930s was influenced by a complex set of factors, and the role of newspaper magnate William Randolph Hearst in that criminalization is a matter of genuine historical debate. The most commonly cited version of the story, which Brian references in the episode, holds that Hearst used his vast media empire to run sensationalized anti-marijuana stories, coining the term reefer madness and associating cannabis use with racial minorities in ways designed to inflame public opinion. The argument is that Hearst had commercial motivations for this campaign, specifically that hemp, a variety of cannabis, was being developed as a competitor to wood pulp in the paper industry, and that Hearst's extensive paper industry investments gave him financial reasons to want hemp suppressed. The historical accuracy of this specific narrative is debated among historians. The Hearst paper industry conspiracy theory has been challenged by researchers who point out that hemp paper was not a sufficiently developed commercial technology in the 1930s to pose a realistic threat to the wood pulp industry, and that the criminalization of marijuana was driven by a more complex set of factors, including racial politics, lobbying by the pharmaceutical industry, and the broader context of Prohibition-era moral regulation. The episode's version of events simplifies a genuinely complicated history. Nevertheless, the core observation that the criminalization of marijuana in the United States was significantly shaped by media sensationalism and by the interests of parties who stood to benefit from criminalization rather than by dispassionate evaluation of the substance's actual risks is defensible and is supported by substantial historical scholarship. The 1936 film Reefer Madness, whatever its specific origins, is a genuine historical artifact of the kind of propaganda that shaped public attitudes toward cannabis in this period. The Marijuana Tax Act of 1937, which effectively criminalized the substance federally, was passed through a congressional process that featured very little scientific testimony and significant social panic. The 420 episodes engagement with this history, while simplified, is more substantive than much of what Family Guy offered as political satire in its later seasons. Brian's speech is not just a vehicle for his pro-legalization position. It is an attempt to root that position in a specific account of why the prohibition it is arguing against came to exist. Whether you agree with the account or not, the episode is doing more intellectual work here than it gets credit for. The episode's conclusion, in which Brian abandons his position the moment he is personally offered something he wants, works as satire, precisely because the show has first given Brian's position genuine substance. The satire of Brian's hypocrisy is sharpest when what he is abandoning actually has value. If the episode had simply presented Brian as motivated by crude personal interest from the beginning, the reversal would have been meaningless. It is meaningful because the episode first does the work of giving Brian something worth abandoning. Deep Dive. The Quagmire's Dad episode in the context of 2010 transgender representation. Quagmire's Dad aired in 2010, which is a significant date in the history of transgender representation in American media. The landscape of how transgender characters and experiences were portrayed in mainstream entertainment in 2010 was drastically different from what it would become in subsequent years. And understanding that landscape helps explain both why the episode was described by its creator as sympathetic and why that description rang so hollow to many members of the transgender community. In 2010, transgender characters in mainstream American television were rare, and the portrayals that did exist were almost uniformly problematic by the standards that would develop over the following decade. Transgender women were frequently played by cisgender men in comedy contexts that emphasized their identities as punchlines. The reveal of a character's transgender identity as a source of shock or disgust was a standard trope, so standard that it had a name in media criticism circles: the transgender reveal as horror device. Shows would introduce what appeared to be a conventionally attractive woman, allow other characters, typically male, to find her attractive, and then reveal her transgender identity as a moment of comedic or dramatic shock, to which the male characters would respond with disgust or anger. Quagmire's Dad deploys exactly this trope, though it does so with more structural complexity than most deployments. Ida is not just a random attractive woman, but has a specific relationship to a main character that gives the reveal layers it would not have if she were a stranger. The Brian subplot is essentially the transgender reveal trope in its most textbook form. Male character is attracted to woman, male character is attracted enough to have sex with her, male character discovers she is a trans woman, male character reacts with extreme disgust. The 30-second vomiting sequence is the trope carried to its logical extreme. By the standards of 2010 mainstream television, Quagmire's Dad was marginally better than the average treatment of transgender characters because it also contained Quagmire's arc toward acceptance, and because Ida was given some interior life and some dignity in the hospital scene. The standard for comparison was low enough that this marginal superiority was real. MacFarlane's claim that the episode would be sympathetic to transgender experience was not a lie he was measuring against the extremely low bar that the surrounding media landscape had established. By the standards that developed in the years immediately following the episode's airdate as shows like Transparent, Pose, Orange is the New Black, and Sense8 began depicting transgender characters with genuine complexity, depth, and humanity, the episode's failings became considerably more visible. The 30-second vomiting sequence, which might have been somewhat defensible as transgressive comedy in the context of 2010's terrible norms, became indefensible in the context of a media landscape that had shown what was actually possible when transgender characters were treated as full human beings. The evolution of GLAAD's response to the episode is itself telling. GLAAD's 2010 criticism was measured and focused on specific problems with the episode's execution. GLAAD's subsequent references to the episode, in later reports on transgender representation in media, used it increasingly as a negative example, as a data point in the argument that mainstream media's history with transgender representation had been one of consistent harm that required active remediation. This is not to say that Quagmire's Dad was uniquely responsible for harm to transgender people. It was one episode among hundreds of problematic portrayals. But it occupies a specific place in that history, the episode that was explicitly promised as sympathetic, that was produced by one of the most prominent animated shows on American television, and that delivered a sustained disgust reaction as its defining visual moment that makes it more notable than the average failed representation. Deep Dive: The Life of Brian Controversy and What It Reveals About the Show's Relationship with Its Audience. The Brian death arc in Season 12 deserves closer examination as a case study in how a show's relationship with its audience can shift from genuine connection to calculated manipulation over the course of many seasons. In the show's early seasons, the relationship between Family Guy and its audience was essentially one of shared discovery. MacFarlane and his writing team were developing the show's voice in real time, testing what worked and what did not, responding to audience enthusiasm for certain characters and certain kinds of comedy in ways that shaped subsequent creative choices. The show's cancellation and revival created a period of intense audience engagement. The DVD sales and Adult Swim ratings were evidence of an audience that cared enough about the show to actively seek it out and to advocate for its return. When the show came back in 2005, it was returning to an audience that had made its return possible, and the early revival seasons reflected an awareness of that specific relationship. The Brian death arc was a product of a fundamentally different relationship. By 2013, the show was in its 12th season. The original audience of passionate fans, who had demanded its return, were now watching with the kind of comfortable familiarity that characterizes long-term relationships with television programs still watching, but no longer particularly excited. Younger viewers who discovered the show through streaming had a different relationship with it, one mediated through access to all seasons simultaneously, rather than through the chronological experience of the show's original broadcast. The audience was large and diffuse rather than intensely engaged, and the show's creative team was grappling with how to generate the kind of excitement and conversation that the show had once generated naturally. The decision to kill Brian was, as MacFarlane confirmed afterward, explicitly designed to generate that excitement artificially. The creative team understood that the audience still cared about Brian as a concept. The show had been running long enough that even viewers who had grown frustrated with the character's flanderization retained an emotional attachment to what he represented, to the Brian of the early seasons who had been genuinely compelling. Killing Brian would activate that residual attachment and generate the kind of audience response, outrage, grief, passionate social media activity that indicated emotional investment. What the creative team apparently did not fully anticipate was the quality of that response. They expected a stir, as MacFarlane described it. They got rage, The distinction between those two reactions tells you something about what the audience actually felt when Brian died. Not just disappointment or surprise, but something closer to genuine grief, which is itself evidence that the emotional investment in the character was more real than the show's creative team had fully appreciated. This creates a painful irony. The show manipulated its audience's emotional investment in Brian to generate a commercial spike in interest, confirming in the process that the emotional investment was genuine and substantial. Had the creative team appreciated how genuine and substantial that investment was, they might have found a way to work with it, rather than exploit it to give Brian's character a genuine arc, to address the ways his Flanderization had damaged the character, to produce an evolution that honored what the audience had loved about him in the early seasons. The death arc demonstrated that the tools to generate that response existed. The resurrection and subsequent return to the Flanderized status quo demonstrated that the creative team had no interest in actually using those tools for genuine storytelling. The fan petition that gathered more than 100,000 signatures is, in this context, one of the more poignant documents of the show's later seasons. It was an audience telling the show that they still cared, that the emotional investment was real, that what the show had done mattered to them. The show heard this, brought Brian back, and then continued doing exactly what it had been doing before. The petition achieved its stated goal and accomplished nothing of lasting significance. Brian returned and continued to be the Brian of the later seasons, not the Brian of the early ones. This outcome is perhaps the most honest summary of the show's relationship with its audience by the time of season 12. The audience cared more than the show did, and the show was willing to use that caring without reciprocating it. End of additional deep dive sections. Closing thoughts. What 3 hours of controversial Family Guy actually teaches us? 3 hours is a long time to spend with any subject, and by this point in the conversation, you have probably formed some strong opinions about the episodes we have covered and about the show that produced them. What I want to offer in closing is not a definitive verdict. The point of this kind of extended analysis is not to arrive at a verdict, but to arrive at a more complex understanding, but a few observations about what this particular body of controversy, taken as a whole, actually tells us. The first thing it tells us is that controversy, in and of itself, is neither good nor bad. It is simply a signal that something touched something real. The controversy around partial terms of endearment is genuinely different in kind from the controversy around Life of Brian, even though both episodes generated widespread discussion and strong public reactions. The first controversy was about what the show was trying to say and who was afraid of it saying it. The second controversy was about whether the show was trying to say anything at all, or simply simulating the appearance of saying something for commercial purposes. Learning to make that distinction between controversy that means something and controversy that is manufactured is useful, not just for understanding Family Guy, but for understanding how media in general works and what it is doing when it generates reactions. The second thing it tells us is that preparation is the difference between ambitious comedy that works and ambitious comedy that causes harm. The episodes we have discussed that failed Screams of Silence, portions of Quagmire's Dad, Not All Dogs Go to Heaven, failed not because the subjects they engaged with were wrong subjects for comedy to engage with, but because the writers did not do sufficient work before engaging with them. Comedy about domestic violence requires understanding domestic violence. Comedy about transgender experience requires understanding transgender experience. Comedy about religion and atheism requires genuine engagement with what thoughtful religious faith actually looks like from the inside, rather than from the outside. The preparation for these subjects was inadequate, and the episodes reflected that inadequacy. The third thing it tells us is about the specific difficulty of sustaining creative ambition across more than 25 seasons of television. Family Guy's best controversial episodes came from the show's earlier seasons, from a period when the writing team was more compact, when MacFarlane was more directly involved in the creative process, when the show was still trying to figure out what it was capable of. As the seasons accumulated, as the writing room turned over, as the show's commercial success made genuine risk-taking less necessary, the ambition that had produced the best controversial episodes gradually gave way to the calculation that produced the worst ones. This is not a story unique to Family Guy. It is a story about what longevity does to creative institutions, and about how difficult it is to sustain the energy that produces genuinely ambitious work over the course of decades. The fourth thing it tells us is about the audience. The people who watched Family Guy across its controversial history were not passive consumers of whatever the show produced. They had opinions, they expressed them, they organized around them, they generated real cultural and institutional consequences through their engagement with what the show did. The petition after Brian's death, the online discussions of Seahorse Seashell Party that spread well beyond the show's immediate fan community, the real-world impact on Mila Kunis of being the voice of a character whose abuse had become a cultural touchstone. Audiences are not just audiences. They are participants in the cultural meaning of what they watch, and their participation shaped what Family Guy became over the course of its long run. And the fifth thing, it tells us the thing that I keep coming back to whenever I think about what this particular long conversation has really been about, is that the best thing about this show was always its willingness to try, the willingness to reach toward difficult subjects, to attempt things that might not work, to be wrong in public rather than safe in private. The episodes that failed did so because they reached further than they were prepared to reach. The episodes that succeeded did so because the reach was accompanied by genuine work and genuine thought. And across both categories, the reaching itself was the thing that made the show interesting, the thing that distinguished it from the many shows that simply avoided difficult subjects entirely and were therefore safe and forgettable. Family Guy was neither safe nor forgettable. Whatever else you might say about it, it was a show that tried to say things, tried to do things, tried to go places that other shows would not go. It failed at this more often than it succeeded, particularly in its later seasons. But the trying was real. That, in the end, is what 3 hours of controversial Family Guy actually teaches us. The trying was real. The subjects mattered. The world paid attention. And sometimes, in the moments when the preparation was equal to the ambition, the show actually arrived somewhere worth going. Thanks for being here tonight. Get some rest. End of script. Extended analysis. The show's relationship with gender and what it revealed over time. One of the most consistent threads running through Family Guy's controversial history is the show's relationship with how it depicted women, and more specifically, how it depicted women who did not conform to the show's preferred version of femininity. The Meg Griffin storyline is the most extreme and most discussed example of this, but it is not the only one, and looking at the broader pattern gives you a clearer picture of where the show's genuine values were, as opposed to the values it claimed to hold. Lois Griffin was, in the show's earliest seasons, one of the more interestingly written women in animated comedy. She was patient without being a doormat, intelligent without being condescending, and capable of genuine exasperation at the family's chaos that read as real rather than performed. Early episodes gave her storylines of her own, her relationship with her wealthy family, and her complicated feelings about having married a working-class man. Her history as a young woman that occasionally surfaced in ways that complicated the image of the conventional stay-at-home mom. Her genuine care for her children that coexisted with equally genuine moments of self-interest and personal desire. She felt like a person. As the seasons progressed, Lois became increasingly defined by her relationship to Peter's stories, rather than by stories of her own. She began to function more as a reactive presence than as an active one, the person whose patience was tested, rather than the person who tested others' patience. Her characterization gradually narrowed around the function she served in the show's family dynamic, which was to be the reasonable counterpoint to Peter's unreasonableness and, when the show wanted to complicate things, to occasionally reveal that her reasonableness was itself a performance concealing less flattering impulses. This narrowing is part of the broader pattern of Flanderization that affected most of the show's main characters in its later seasons, and it is worth noting that it happened to Lois in a gender-specific way. The aspects of her character that were reduced were the aspects that gave her independent agency, her personal history, her desires, her life outside her relationship to Peter. What remained were the aspects that defined her in relation to her husband and children. She became more of a wife and mother and less of a person, and this happened gradually enough that it was easy not to notice until you compared a late-season Lois to the Lois of the first 3 seasons and realized how much had been quietly removed. The treatment of Meg is the extreme version of this pattern. Where Lois was gradually narrowed from a person to a function, Meg was gradually hollowed out and then filled with something ugly. She became a container not just for the show's domestic dysfunction, but for the show's most contemptuous attitudes toward a specific kind of woman. The Meg jokes, at their worst, were not jokes about an individual character's individual traits. They were jokes about a type, the unattractive, socially unsuccessful, emotionally desperate young woman, and they used Meg as the vehicle for contempt toward that type, rather than as a genuine character worthy of attention and respect. This distinction matters because it explains why the Meg abuse felt categorically different from the show's other kinds of character mistreatment. Peter was mocked for being stupid, but stupidity is a trait, and the mocking acknowledged Peter as a person who happened to have this trait. Quagmire was mocked for being sexually aggressive, but again, the mocking acknowledged Quagmire as a person with a specific characteristic being held up to scrutiny. Meg was mocked for existing in the body she was born with, for wanting things that any person might want, for simply being the kind of person she was. The contempt was not for a trait, it was for the person. The fact that the show's most sustained, most explicit, and most documentably harmful treatment of a character happened to be its treatment of its primary young female character is significant. It reflects patterns in American comedy culture that go well beyond Family Guy. The specific targeting of unattractive or socially unsuccessful young women as figures of contempt is a recurring feature of a certain strain of American comedy that has been widely criticized from a gender studies perspective. Family Guy did not invent this pattern, but it deployed it with particular sustained intensity and did so at a moment of significant cultural visibility. The addition of women to the show's writing staff in later seasons produced measurable change in how Meg was treated. This is itself an important data point. It suggests that the sustained cruelty toward Meg was not an inevitable feature of the show's comedy, but a product of who was in the room making decisions about the show's comedy. When the composition of that room changed, the comedy changed. The implication that the room's composition in the earlier seasons had shaped the show's worst tendencies as much as any other single factor is uncomfortable but important. Extended analysis: how the show's political comedy evolved and where it went wrong. Family Guy's political comedy is one of its most discussed features and one of its most inconsistent. The show has always engaged with political subjects, but the nature of that engagement has shifted considerably across its 25-plus-year run, and the trajectory of those shifts is worth examining carefully. In the show's earliest seasons, the political comedy was primarily observational and relatively even-handed. The show made jokes about American political culture in ways that were sharp without being ideologically specific, jokes about the absurdity of political processes, the gap between politicians' public statements and their actual motivations, the way that media culture shaped political discourse. The comedy was recognizable as coming from a liberal sensibility, but it was not primarily organized around partisan advocacy. It was organized around the comedy of political life itself. As the show progressed through its revival seasons and into the years of the Obama presidency and the Tea Party backlash, the political comedy became increasingly explicit about its ideological position. Brian Griffin became the primary vehicle for this shift. As the character's political views became more central to his function on the show increasingly used him as a delivery mechanism for specific political arguments, rather than as a vehicle for comedy about political life in general. Episodes like Not All Dogs Go to Heaven and 420 are examples of this shift. They are organized around specific positions. Atheism is legitimate, marijuana legalization is correct, rather than around the comedy of political conflict. This shift had several consequences for the quality of the political comedy. The most important was that explicitly partisan comedy has a much shorter shelf life than observational political comedy. Jokes about the general absurdity of political processes remain comprehensible and broadly applicable regardless of the specific political moment. Jokes about specific positions in specific political debates are tied to the moment of their production and age rapidly as the political context changes. 420 is less funny in a world where marijuana legalization has become a mainstream policy position in many American states than it was in 2009 when legalization was still a fringe position. Not All Dogs Go to Heaven is less interesting in a cultural moment where public atheism has become more normalized than it was when the episode aired. The deeper problem is that explicitly partisan comedy requires the audience to share the comedian's political commitments to find the comedy fully satisfying. South Park, which has consistently engaged with political subjects across its run, has managed this by being genuinely adversarial toward positions across the political spectrum, by being willing to mock progressive positions as readily as conservative ones, which frustrates partisan viewers on both sides but preserves the comedy's independence from any specific political alignment. Family Guy, by contrast, developed an increasingly clear liberal alignment that made its political comedy feel less like comedy and more like advocacy dressed up as comedy. MacFarlane has been explicit about his own political commitments. He is a liberal Democrat who has donated to Democratic candidates and causes, who has been publicly critical of Fox News, and who has used his creative platforms to express political positions without apology. None of this is wrong. Artists have political views, and those views inevitably shape their work. The question is not whether MacFarlane's politics should influence the show, but whether the influence was managed in ways that served the comedy, or whether it was deployed in ways that reduced the comedy to political messaging. In the show's worst politically motivated episodes, the answer is clearly the latter. Brian Griffin delivering extended monologues about marijuana policy or the irrationality of religious faith is not comedy. It is advocacy. The comedy framework around those monologues, the other characters' reactions, the cutaway gags that punctuate them, is not sufficient to transform political argument into political comedy. Political comedy requires a recognition of the genuine complexity and genuine comedy potential in political life, not just confident assertion of correct positions. The show's best political moments scattered across its run, but more common in the earlier seasons, worked because they engaged with political absurdity rather than political positions. The PTV episode is politically motivated, but it is also genuinely funny because its target is not a specific political position, but the specific institutional absurdity of the FCC's post-Super Bowl enforcement posture. The comedy comes from the escalating absurdity of the censorship rather than from the correctness of the position opposing it. You do not need to share MacFarlane's views on broadcast regulation to find the image of a government agent bleeping a dog's bark genuinely funny. The difference between those two kinds of political comedy, comedy about absurdity, and comedy asserting positions, is the difference between the show's political highs and its political lows. The highs are high because they find something genuinely comic in the messy, complicated reality of political life. The lows are low because they substitute confident assertion of correct positions for actual comedy, and confident assertion, however correct the positions being asserted, is never actually funny. Extended analysis. The economics of controversy and why Family Guy kept generating it. It would be naive to discuss Family Guy's history of controversy without acknowledging the commercial dimension of that controversy. Controversy, for a television show, is not simply a liability. Under the right conditions, it is also an asset, and Family Guy understood this relationship from very early in its history. The mechanism is straightforward. Controversy generates news coverage. News coverage generates awareness among people who might not otherwise watch the show. Some portion of those people, out of curiosity or solidarity or contrarianism, watch the show or at least engage with discussions about it. This engagement translates into ratings, into social media activity, into the kind of cultural presence that keeps a show viable in an increasingly competitive media landscape. A show that generates no controversy and no strong reactions is also a show that generates no organic media coverage and no passionate word-of-mouth advocacy. A show that regularly does something that people feel strongly about, even if that feeling is negative, maintains a cultural presence that purely inoffensive shows do not achieve. Family Guy understood this dynamic early. The show's history of being targeted by the Parents Television Council, of generating FCC complaints, of being named to worst shows lists by advocacy organizations, had the consistent side effect of generating publicity that the show's marketing budget could never have purchased. Every PTC press release about Family Guy was, from the show's perspective, free advertising to an audience that might find the show's transgressive reputation attractive rather than repellent. This dynamic created an incentive for the show to maintain a certain level of controversy as a matter of commercial strategy. Not controversy so extreme that advertisers would pull out en masse, but controversy sufficient to maintain the show's reputation as something genuinely transgressive and therefore worth watching. The calibration of this controversy, how far to push, what subjects to engage with, how much to walk back after pushing, was as much a commercial calculation as a creative one. The Life of Brian arc is the most explicit example of this dynamic being deployed consciously and at scale. The death of Brian was, as MacFarlane confirmed, designed to generate a specific kind of reaction. The designers of that reaction knew their product and knew their audience well enough to accurately predict what would happen. They generated the controversy, harvested the attention it produced, and then return to the status quo once the commercial value of the controversy had been extracted. What this dynamic does to a show over time is complex. In the short term, it maintains commercial viability by keeping the show in the cultural conversation. In the medium term, it erodes creative credibility by demonstrating to the audience that the show's apparent daring is often calculated rather than genuine. In the long term, it produces diminishing returns, because an audience that has learned to interpret the show's controversies as commercial strategies will stop responding to them with the kind of genuine emotional engagement that makes them commercially valuable in the first place. Family Guy's ratings trajectory across its run illustrates this dynamic clearly. The post-revival seasons generated controversy and strong ratings. As the seasons accumulated, the controversy continued, but the ratings declined. The audience had learned, over many seasons, to distinguish between the show's genuine reaching and its calculated provocations, and was responding accordingly. By the time the show's viewership had declined to under 1 million households per episode, the controversy machine was still running, but the commercial returns it was generating had diminished to the point where the relationship between controversy and commercial value had essentially inverted. The show was still capable of generating controversy, but that controversy was no longer capable of generating meaningful viewership spikes. This is the natural life cycle of a controversy-dependent commercial strategy. It works until the audience becomes sophisticated enough about the strategy to stop responding to it, at which point the strategy has nowhere to go. Family Guy, by its 23rd season, was in exactly this position, still generating occasional controversy, still making news with individual episodes or creative decisions, but doing so for an audience that had already decided, in large numbers, that the controversy was no longer worth the investment of their time. End of script. Extended analysis. What South Park got right about Family Guy and what they missed. No conversation about Family Guy's controversial history would be complete without addressing the most famous and most sustained external criticism the show ever received. The two-part South Park episode, Cartoon Wars, which aired in April 2006 and which constituted a direct and extended attack on Family Guy's creative methods. In those episodes, South Park creators Trey Parker and Matt Stone depicted Family Guy's joke-writing process as being performed by manatees randomly pushing idea balls together to generate combinations of unrelated elements. The criticism was explicit and deliberate, that Family Guy's cutaway gags had no genuine connection to each other or to the show's narrative, that they were essentially random, and that therefore the show required no actual comedic skill to produce. Parker and Stone were arguing that Family Guy was not genuinely written so much as assembled from random components, and that this assembly process produced the illusion of comedy without the substance of it. McFarlane's response to the Cartoon Wars episodes was public and pointed. He characterized the criticism as coming from a place of professional rivalry rather than genuine artistic disagreement, and he was not entirely wrong about this. Parker and Stone had reason to dislike Family Guy's commercial success and cultural profile, and the Cartoon Wars episodes were at minimum partly motivated by that dislike. He also argued that the manatee metaphor was unfair because it misrepresented how the show's cutaway gags were actually generated, which were the product of deliberate writing choices rather than random combination. Both sides of this argument have merit. Parker and Stone's criticism was motivated by rivalry and applied with a broad brush that did not distinguish between the show's better and worse cutaway gags. The early seasons of Family Guy contained cutaway gags that were genuinely clever, genuinely connected to the show's narrative and emotional logic, and genuinely funny in ways that reflected specific, writerly choices rather than random combination. The manatee metaphor was accurate about the worst of the show's later seasons, but unfair as a description of the show across its entire run. At the same time, McFarlane's defense somewhat missed the point of the criticism's most valid dimension. The most accurate version of the Cartoon Wars criticism is not that Family Guy's cutaway gags were literally randomly generated, but that they were increasingly disconnected from the show's narrative and emotional logic in ways that made them functionally interchangeable. You could often move a cutaway gag from one episode to another without changing anything meaningful about either episode, which is itself a sign of insufficient narrative integration. The episodes that best represent what Parker and Stone were criticizing are the later season episodes in which the cutaway gags dominate the runtime to the point where the ostensible plot of the episode is merely connective tissue between gags rather than a story that the gags illuminate or enrich. In these episodes, the cutaway gag has metastasized from an additive comedic technique to the primary substance of the episode itself. And the result is exactly what Cartoon Wars described: a collection of disconnected sketches that do not add up to anything coherent. The Cartoon Wars criticism also produced one of the more illuminating pieces of confirmation that emerged from Family Guy's creative team. It was reported that after the South Park episodes aired, Parker and Stone received phone calls from writers on both The Simpsons and King of the Hill, thanking them for making the episodes. This detail, if accurate, suggests that professionals working in adjacent creative spaces shared at least some of Parker and Stone's concerns about Family Guy's approach to comedy. It suggests that the Cartoon Wars criticism, despite its satirical exaggeration and its competitive motivations, was touching something real about the show that others in the industry recognized. The relationship between South Park and Family Guy across the years is itself one of the more interesting dynamics in animated comedy history. The two shows share a similar willingness to engage with controversial subjects, a similar adversarial relationship with broadcast standards and social norms, and a similar ability to generate significant cultural conversation around individual episodes and creative decisions. But they have approached these shared characteristics with fundamentally different methods and fundamentally different long-term outcomes. South Park has maintained a genuine adversarial relationship with positions across the political spectrum, has continued to generate creative risks that are actual risks rather than calculated provocations, and has managed to sustain creative credibility across a run that is even longer than Family Guy's. Family Guy, particularly in its later seasons, became increasingly predictable in its targets, increasingly calculated in its provocations, and increasingly dependent on the appearance of risk-taking rather than the substance of it. Whether this divergence reflects fundamental differences in creative philosophy, differences in how the two shows are managed and produced, or simply the cumulative effect of different creative choices over many seasons, is a question without a clean answer. What is clear is that both shows started from similar positions in the early 2000s and arrived at very different places, and that the journey between those positions tells you something interesting about what separates durable, creative irreverence from commercial simulation of it. Extended analysis. The "When You Wish Upon a Weinstein" copyright case and what it means. The lawsuit filed by Born Music publishers against Fox and Family Guy over the "I Need a Jew" song from When You Wish Upon a Weinstein is, in some ways, the most legally interesting controversy in the show's history, because it raised genuinely significant questions about the boundaries of parody as a legal defense in copyright cases. American copyright law protects parody under the doctrine of fair use, but the protection is narrower than many people assume. The key legal requirement is that a parody must comment on or critique the original work it is parodying. The parody must use the original work as its target, not merely as a convenient vehicle for expressing something unrelated to the original. In the Supreme Court's 1994 decision in Campbell v. Acuff Rose Music, the court held that Two Live Crew's parody of "Oh, Pretty Woman" was protected fair use because it commented on the original song. It used Roy Orbison's classic as its target, transforming it in ways that constituted commentary on the original. Born Music publishers' argument against "I Need a Jew" was that Peter Griffin's song used the melody of "When You Wish Upon a Star" without commenting on "When You Wish Upon a Star." The song is about Peter wanting a Jewish financial advisor. It uses the melody of a Disney song about wishing on stars. The two subjects have no relationship to each other. Therefore, Born argued, the song was not genuine parody, it was copyright infringement using a legal defense that did not apply. This is a genuinely interesting legal argument that has real merit on its face. The "When You Wish Upon a Star" melody is being used in "I Need a Jew" because it is a recognizable tune that audiences will immediately identify, not because the song is commenting on anything about wishing on stars or about Pinocchio or about the Disney song specifically. The connection between the original and the parody is purely a matter of musical recognition, not of conceptual or critical relationship. Fox's defense was that "I Need a Jew" does constitute parody in the legally relevant sense that it uses the wishful yearning emotional register of "When You Wish Upon a Star" to comment on the absurdity of Peter's wishful yearning for a Jewish financial savior, and that this commentary makes the use of the original melody fair use rather than infringement. This defense is less straightforward than the fair use arguments in most parody cases, but it was ultimately accepted by the court. The case settled in Fox's favor in 2009, with the court finding that the song qualified as parody. But the legal journey was expensive and prolonged, and the uncertainty that surrounded the case during its 4-year duration represented a real risk for the show's producers. If the court had found for Bourne, it would have established a precedent with significant implications for how animated comedy shows could use recognizable musical materials in their satirical content. The case is also interesting as a commentary on the show's creative methods more broadly. Family Guy has made extensive use of recognizable popular culture songs, films, television shows, public figures as raw material for its comedy across its entire run. Some of this use is clearly parody in the legally robust sense, where the show is genuinely commenting on the original material. Some of it is simply reference using recognizable materials as comedic shorthand, without engaging in anything that could be characterized as critique of the original. The Bourne lawsuit was a challenge to the show, to demonstrate that a specific piece of its content fell into the first category rather than the second, and the show succeeded in making that demonstration. But the challenge itself revealed something about how thin the line sometimes is between protected parody and unprotected appropriation in the show's creative practice. Extended analysis: how the Sarah Palin controversy illuminates the limits of political satire. The controversy over extra-large medium and the former governor of Alaska line is worth examining in more detail for what it reveals about the specific challenges of political satire in animated comedy, particularly about the ethics of using real public figures and their families in comedic content. American law generally treats political satire involving public figures as protected speech, and the courts have consistently upheld the right of comedians and satirists to mock, caricature, and even make false statements about public figures in contexts where the satirical nature of the statements is evident. This protection exists because political satire has historically been one of the most important mechanisms by which citizens hold their leaders accountable, and because suppressing political satire is one of the most common tools of authoritarian governance. The specific complication introduced by the extra-large medium episode is that the satire did not target Sarah Palin directly. It targeted her through a fictional representation of her child. The former governor of Alaska line in Ellen's dialogue was a way of referencing Palin without depicting her directly, but the reference was sufficiently clear that its connection to Palin's actual son with Down syndrome was immediately obvious. The satirical jab was aimed at Palin. The vehicle for the jab was a fictional character explicitly associated with Palin's actual child. This creates a genuine ethical tension even within a framework that fully supports political satire of public figures. Palin's son Trig did not choose to be a public figure. He was made one by his mother's public use of him at political events and by media coverage of his birth and his condition. His presence in American public life was the product of choices made by others rather than by any choice of his own. Using him, or a fictional analog of him, as a vehicle for political commentary about his mother raises questions about whether the satirical ends justify the potential discomfort to a child who has no ability to consent to or object to his use as a political symbol. The response from Andrea Faye Friedman complicates this ethical picture in important ways. Friedman, who actually has Down syndrome, who actually performed the role in question, and who is therefore in some sense a peer of the person whose interests are supposedly being protected, offered a clear and forceful statement that she found the episode's content appropriate, funny, and not in any way damaging to her sense of dignity or to the dignity of people with Down syndrome. Her response did not resolve the underlying ethical question whether someone can consent on behalf of a group to the way that group is represented, but it did substantially undermine the specific claim that people with Down syndrome were being harmed or disrespected by the episode. What Friedman's response ultimately illustrated is that the ethics of political satire involving marginalized communities are not simply determined by the intentions of the satirists or by the reactions of people outside those communities. The relevant ethical question is what the people within the communities being depicted actually think of the depiction. And when that question is answered clearly, as it was by Friedman, the answer carries considerably more weight than the objections of a politician claiming to speak on those communities' behalf. Palin's framing of her objection as protection of her son and of people with Down syndrome was challenged directly by someone who actually has Down syndrome and who found the framing patronizing and the episode itself funny. The challenge stuck. The controversy largely resolved in the show's favor, not because the show's creators won a legal or institutional argument, but because the person most directly relevant to the ethical question offered an answer that the show's critics could not easily dismiss. This dynamic, the relevance of the voices of actually affected communities in determining the ethics of representations, would become more explicitly central to media criticism in the years following the episodes airing, as conversations about representation, consent, and who gets to speak became more sophisticated and more prominent in public discourse. The extra-large medium controversy is, in some ways, an early instance of that dynamic playing out in real time, before the theoretical frameworks for understanding it were as well developed as they would later become. Extended analysis, the animation style and how it shaped controversial content. One dimension of Family Guy's controversial history that rarely gets discussed in depth is the relationship between the show's visual style and how its controversial content landed with audiences. Animation is not a neutral delivery mechanism. The choices made about how things are drawn, how movement is animated, and what visual language is used to frame particular kinds of content all affect how that content is received. And Family Guy's animation, which went through several distinct phases across its run, shaped the controversial episodes in ways that are worth examining. The show's original animation, across the first 3 seasons, had a quality that animators and animation enthusiasts sometimes describe as rubbery. The characters moved in ways that felt slightly loose, slightly organic, slightly variable from moment to moment, in ways that gave them a quality of life that more precisely rendered animation can lack. This quality served the show's comedy well. When Peter fell down the stairs or got into a fight or hurt himself, the animation of those events had a visceral energy that made the physical comedy land with real impact. The characters felt like they inhabited their physical world in a way that made their interactions with it funny rather than clinical. When the show returned from cancellation in 2005, the animation had been redesigned. The outlines were thicker and more consistent. The characters moved more rigidly. The overall look was cleaner and more polished, but also less alive. This shift affected the show's comedy in ways that are difficult to quantify but real. The physical comedy that had been a strength of the early seasons became somewhat less effective under the new animation regime because the characters' movements had less energy and less spontaneity. More relevantly for our purposes, the shift in animation style also affected how the show's darker content was received. The early season's animation had a quality that kept even dark content at a slight emotional distance. The rubbery visual language communicated that this was a cartoon world operating by cartoon rules, which made the darkness feel managed and safe. The later animation, while technically more polished, was in some ways more realistic. The characters' proportions and movements were more consistent and less exaggerated, and this increased realism made certain kinds of dark content land more heavily than they might have. Under the original animation style, the violence in the show's later seasons, which became considerably more graphic than the violence of the early seasons, was partly a product of the show's animation becoming sufficiently realistic that graphic violence could be depicted with enough detail to be genuinely disturbing. Under the early animation style, depicting a character's exposed brain or a graphic injury with the level of visual specificity that some later episodes included would have been more visually incongruous and therefore less disturbing. The later animation's consistency and polish made these depictions more coherent with the visual logic of the show's world, and therefore more genuinely unsettling. This dynamic was noticed by critics and audiences without always being articulated precisely. Many discussions of the show's declining quality in its later seasons noted that the humor had become darker or meaner, without always identifying the animation style as a contributing factor. The animation style was not the primary driver of the content the writing was, but it shaped how the content was experienced in ways that reinforced the shift toward graphic violence and graphic consequences that the later seasons pursued. The Screams of Silence episode is an interesting case study in this relationship. The episode played the domestic violence straight, rather than through the comedic animation language the show usually employed, and this choice interacted with the show's later animation style in complex ways. The scenes of Jeff abusing Brenda were animated with the same visual language as the rest of the episode, which by this point in the show's history was polished and relatively realistic. This meant that the violence, when it appeared, did not look like cartoon violence. It looked like a reasonably realistic depiction of physical abuse. This increased the emotional impact of those scenes in ways that the writing then failed to support. The visual reality of the abuse was more powerful than the script's handling of it, creating a dissonance between what the animation was communicating and what the story was doing with what it had communicated. Extended analysis: the specific episodes we didn't cover and why they matter. In a 3-hour survey of Family Guy's controversial episodes, there will always be material that does not make the cut. Tonight's survey has focused on episodes that generated controversy for reasons connected to substantive social and cultural issues. Episodes about abortion, domestic violence, drug policy, religion, transgender identity, disability, and the ethics of death as a storytelling device. But there are other categories of controversy in the show's history that are worth at least acknowledging, even if a full examination is beyond our scope tonight. There is, for instance, the controversy generated by the show's treatment of its own characters' suffering in ways that crossed from comedy into something closer to torture. The extended sequences in later seasons of characters experiencing pain, the famous knee injury gag that lasted for what felt like an eternity, the Conway Twitty gag that replaced actual comedy with a full performance of a country song simply because the writing room had run out of material, were controversial. Not because of any specific social issue they engaged with, but because they represented a show failing to respect its own audience's time and intelligence. This category of controversy is perhaps the most common and the most chronic in the show's later seasons, and it contributed as much to the declining viewership as any single controversial episode. There is also the controversy generated by the show's treatment of racial and ethnic stereotypes in ways that did not always rise to the level of the Cleveland Loretta episode, but that were nonetheless consistent enough to warrant examination. Family Guy has, across its run, made jokes about virtually every racial and ethnic group represented in American society, and the quality and intent of those jokes has varied enormously. Some were sharp satire that exposed real dynamics in American racial politics. Others were lazy appropriations of stereotypes without any satirical frame that would give them meaning beyond the stereotype itself. The show's defenders argued that it made fun of everyone equally, which is at least partially true. The show's critics argued that making fun of everyone equally does not make any specific joke more acceptable, which is also true. The tension between those two positions has never been resolved and was never resolved within the show itself. There is also the controversy generated by the show's early seasons' depiction of characters who were, by the standards of later years, identified as pedophilic Herbert, the elderly man whose attraction to young boys was played as a running joke across many seasons. This is perhaps the most difficult category of the show's controversial content to discuss, because the show was explicitly playing the character's attraction as a joke, as something grotesque and comic, rather than endorsing or normalizing it. Whether this framing is sufficient to justify the repeated use of pedophilia as a comedic premise is a genuine question that does not have a clean answer. The character generated criticism from multiple directions and also, paradoxically, something like affection from portions of the fan base who responded to the character's vocal performance and comedic timing rather than to the premise his existence embodied. These categories of controversy are part of the complete picture of Family Guy's controversial history, even if they are not the focus of tonight's conversation. The show's complete controversial record is considerably richer and more complicated than any single survey can fully capture, which is itself part of what makes it one of the more interesting objects of study in American television history. Extended analysis: the show's influence on subsequent animated comedy. Family Guy's controversial history did not exist in a vacuum. The show's willingness to engage with controversial subjects, its specific methods of doing so, and the reactions those methods generated all had influence on the subsequent landscape of adult animated comedy in ways that are visible in the decades of shows that came after it. The most direct influence is visible in the wave of adult animated comedies that followed Family Guy's revival in 2005. Shows like American Dad, The Cleveland Show, Bob's Burgers, Archer, Rick and Morty, and dozens of others developed in a media environment that had been shaped by Family Guy's commercial success and by the audience appetite for adult animation that Family Guy's revival had demonstrated. Many of these shows engaged with the lessons of Family Guy's controversial history, both the lessons about what worked and the lessons about what did not. American Dad, which premiered on the same night as Family Guy's revival and which was created by many of the same people, is the most instructive comparison. The show made a fundamental structural choice that distinguished it from Family Guy from the beginning. It did not use cutaway gags. This single decision forced American Dad to develop as a more narratively coherent show, one in which each episode had to earn its comedy through character and plot rather than through disconnected random sketches. The result, as the show developed across its seasons, was a show that maintained substantially higher quality across a comparable run than Family Guy managed. Rick and Morty, which premiered in 2013 and became one of the defining animated comedies of the following decade, drew on elements of Family Guy's approach: the irreverence, the willingness to engage with dark subjects, the use of science fiction and absurdism as vehicles for genuine emotional content, while systematically addressing the weaknesses that had plagued Family Guy. Rick and Morty used its formal innovations not just as comedy techniques, but as genuine vehicles for emotional and philosophical exploration. Its controversial episodes, and it generated several significant controversies across its run, tended to be controversial in the productive sense. They were doing something real, reaching for something genuine, and the controversy they generated was the controversy of genuine creative ambition rather than calculated provocation. BoJack Horseman took the animated comedy format further into genuinely dark territory than any previous show in the genre, addressing addiction, depression, sexual abuse, abortion, and other difficult subjects with a level of care and psychological accuracy that set a new standard for what animated comedy could aspire to. BoJack Horseman did this partly by learning from the failures of shows like Family Guy that had attempted similar subjects without adequate preparation, by taking the preparation seriously, by involving people with relevant expertise, by centering the experiences of people within the communities being depicted, rather than depicting those communities from the outside. The contrast between BoJack Horseman's handling of difficult subjects and Family Guy's handling of them is as clear an illustration as exists of what separates ambitious animation from merely provocative animation. Both shows were willing to go to dark places. One went to dark places with the work that darkness requires. The other went to dark places that it had not done enough work to understand, and the results reflected that difference. Family Guy's influence on this subsequent landscape is therefore ambiguous. It can demonstrate that there was a substantial audience for adult animated comedy that engaged with serious subjects and was willing to go places that mainstream broadcast comedy avoided. This demonstration was genuinely important. Without Family Guy's commercial success in the revival era, many of the shows that came after it might not have had the opportunity to be made. But the specific methods Family Guy used to achieve that commercial success, the cutaway dependency, the increasingly calculated controversy, the unwillingness to sustain genuine character development, were exactly the things that the best subsequent shows had to move away from in order to achieve genuine creative quality. Family Guy is, in this sense, one of the most complicated cases of influence in recent television history. A show whose commercial success was necessary for the development of a form it was itself unable to fully realize. The shows that learned from Family Guy's mistakes were made possible by Family Guy's success. The irony of that relationship is not lost on anyone who has watched the arc of adult animated comedy across the quarter century since Family Guy's premiere. Final thoughts. A genuine appreciation for the mess of it all. After everything we have covered tonight, the bans and the backlashes, the successes and the failures, the genuine reaching and the calculated simulation of reaching, what I find myself feeling, perhaps surprisingly, is something close to genuine appreciation for the show that Family Guy actually was rather than the show it sometimes claimed to be. Not appreciation for every choice it made. Some of the choices were genuinely harmful, and we have been honest about that. Not appreciation for the commercial calculation that drove some of its most famous controversies. That calculation was real, and it did not serve the show's artistic interests. But appreciation for the fact that it tried, repeatedly and publicly, to be more than it was comfortable being. The show that aired partial terms of endearment, knowing it would be controversial, was doing something genuine. The show that used PTV to make a real argument about broadcast censorship was doing something genuine. The show that gave Meg her speech in Seahorse Seashell Party, even if it then refused to follow through on that speech, was at least in that moment doing something genuine. The genuine moments are scattered through the show's history in ways that reward the attention required to find them. Television is a commercial medium. It exists to generate revenue, and the compromises required to generate revenue reliably over many seasons are real and significant. The miracle is not that Family Guy made so many compromises across its run that was inevitable, and any show that ran for 25 years would have accumulated its own set of compromises. The miracle is that despite the compromises, despite the commercial calculations, despite the declining preparation, and the increasing distance from the creator whose vision had produced the show's best work, there were still moments scattered through even the show's most troubled seasons where something genuine showed through. Those moments are what make the controversial history worth examining, rather than simply condemning. A show that was purely cynical, purely calculated, purely commercial would not generate the kinds of genuine controversies that Screams of Silence and Seahorse Seashell Party and Partial Terms of Endearment generated. Those controversies happened because the show was still, somewhere inside its increasingly commercial framework, trying. Trying imperfectly, trying with inadequate preparation, trying in ways that sometimes caused harm rather than good, but trying. That is the final thing that Family Guy's controversial history tells us. Even at its most compromised, even in the episodes that failed most completely, the show was reaching for something beyond the purely safe and the purely profitable. The reach was inconsistent and often inadequate, but it was real. And for a show that has been on the air for over 25 years, in an industry that rewards safety and punishes genuine risk, the persistence of even that imperfect reaching is something worth acknowledging. Thanks for spending this time with these ideas. Thanks for caring enough about a weird, messy, ambitious, sometimes brilliant, often disappointing show to listen to 3 hours of analysis about the moments when it got into trouble and what those moments mean. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe if you haven't. Get some rest. End of script. Extended section. The Meg Griffin Rehabilitation and what it teaches us about writers' rooms. One of the genuinely interesting late-season developments in Family Guy's history is what happened to the character of Meg Griffin after the most extreme period of her abuse ended. The shift was gradual, but it was real, and understanding what drove it teaches something important about how writers' room composition shapes the content of the rooms they produce. The shift in Meg's treatment began roughly around season 14 and became more pronounced in subsequent seasons. Where earlier seasons had structured entire episodes around the comedy of Meg's misery episodes, where the joke was always that Meg suffered, that she was unwanted, that she was ugly and unlovable and fundamentally deserving of whatever mistreatment she received, later seasons began giving Meg storylines in which she was not the target, episodes in which she demonstrated competence, episodes in which other characters treated her with something approaching respect, episodes in which the show engaged with her inner life in a way that acknowledged her as a full person rather than as a punchline. The change has been attributed, by multiple people who have commented publicly on the show's production history, to the addition of more women to the writing staff. This is a striking piece of information because of what it implies about who was making the decisions that produced the decade of Meg abuse. If the addition of women to the room produced measurable improvement in how the show's primary young female character was treated, then the previous composition of the room, which was heavily male, was producing the abuse not through malice but through the kind of blind spot that develops when the people making decisions about a character's experience do not share that experience or the experiences it is rooted in. This is not a simple story about bad men deliberately harming women for entertainment. The people in the earlier writing rooms were, by all accounts, not people with conscious contempt for women. They were people who found a certain kind of comedy funny, the comedy of the designated loser, of the person whose misery generates reactions, of the character whose role in the group is to absorb everyone else's frustration. This kind of comedy has a long history and is not inherently gendered. But when the designated loser is always the primary young female character, and when the form of her misery is consistently her physical unattractiveness and her emotional neediness, the comedy takes on a gendered character that the people producing it may not have fully recognized, precisely because they were not in a position to recognize it. The women who joined the writing staff were in exactly that position. They recognized what the comedy was doing because they were members of the group being used as the material for the comedy. And when they pushed back against it, when they argued that the sustained abuse of this character was not just unfunny but actively harmful in what it communicated, the room listened. Not immediately, not completely, but enough to produce measurable change in how the character was treated. This dynamic is worth understanding clearly because it speaks to a genuine principle of creative production. The experiences and perspectives of the people in the room determine what the room is capable of seeing in the material it is producing. A room composed entirely of people who share the same background and the same perspective will have systematic blind spots that a more diverse room would not have. Those blind spots will produce systematic failures in the content the room generates. Failures that the room itself cannot see precisely because the blind spots are blind. External critics may see the failures, as critics of Family Guy's treatment of Meg consistently did for years. But external criticism is much less effective at changing content than internal advocacy from people whose presence in the room changes what the room is capable of seeing. Family Guy's Meg problem was a writer's room problem before it was a content problem. The content was the symptom. The composition of the room was the cause. And the eventual improvement in the content, when it came from changing the room rather than from any amount of external pressure, however accurate and however sustained. Extended section. The Family Guy universe and crossover controversy. Family Guy exists within what is sometimes called the MacFarlane-verse, the universe of animated shows created by Seth MacFarlane that includes American Dad, The Cleveland Show, and occasional crossover episodes between them. Understanding how controversy was managed differently across these different shows, and how the crossover episodes navigated the different creative cultures of the shows they brought together, adds another dimension to the story of Family Guy's controversial history. American Dad, as we have noted elsewhere tonight, made the structural decision not to use cutaway gags and developed as a more narratively coherent show as a result. But it also made a subtler decision about how to handle controversial subjects. It tended to engage with them through the specific dynamics of the Smith family rather than through standalone episodes designed primarily around the controversial subject itself. When American Dad addressed serious subjects, it did so by running them through characters who had established histories and relationships, which gave the treatment of those subjects more texture and more emotional accuracy than a show could achieve by constructing an episode from scratch around a subject that the characters had no prior relationship to. This difference in approach produced a difference in outcomes. American Dad's controversial episodes were, on average, better handled than Family Guy's controversial episodes, not because American Dad was a morally superior show, but because its structural approach made it better equipped to handle difficult subjects with the specificity and texture they require. The Cleveland Show, which occupied a middle position between the two and which ran for 4 seasons from 2009 to 2013, had its own set of controversies, but its shorter run meant that it had less opportunity to develop either the strengths or the weaknesses of its siblings in the MacFarlane-verse. The crossover episodes between these shows are their own category of potential controversy because they brought together characters from different creative cultures and required the writing teams to negotiate between different sets of established norms. The most significant crossover from a controversy perspective was the Simpsons crossover episode from Season 13 of Family Guy, which we mentioned briefly in the context of Meg's storyline. That crossover, produced not within the MacFarlane-verse but as a collaboration between 2 competing Fox animated franchises, raised its own questions about how 2 very different creative cultures would negotiate the boundaries of what each show was willing to do when working together. The crossover was, by most accounts, a diplomatic rather than creatively ambitious piece of television. It found the zones of shared comfort between the 2 shows and stayed within them rather than pushing either show toward the other's approach. The Meg-Lisa storyline was a genuine bright spot, allowing Meg a moment of dignity and connection that the Family Guy writing room might not have generated independently, but that the presence of Lisa Simpson, a character defined by her intelligence and her compassion and her recognition of others' worth, made possible. This suggests something interesting about the potential for crossover episodes as creative catalysts that, bringing together characters from different creative cultures, can produce possibilities that neither culture would generate on its own. The Simpsons crossover's treatment of Meg was better for having Lisa Simpson to play against. What this means in practice is that the show's controversial history might have been somewhat different, might have included fewer of the worst failures, if the writing room had been more consistently forced to engage with perspectives and creative cultures different from its own. Extended section. What the show's history tells us about creative longevity. Family Guy is now one of the longest-running animated comedies in American television history. It has outlasted most of its contemporaries, survived 2 cancellations, and a network era that has changed almost beyond recognition. and continued to produce new episodes at a time when the media landscape that gave birth to it has been transformed by streaming, social media, and the fragmentation of mass audience culture. This longevity is remarkable and worth thinking about carefully. The conventional wisdom about creative longevity in television that shows inevitably decline as they age, that the spark of originality that makes a show great cannot be sustained indefinitely, that the institutional pressures of long-running production gradually erode the qualities that made the show worth making in the first place, is strongly supported by Family Guy's history. The show's best work came in its early seasons. Its worst came in its middle and later seasons. The arc from original to compromised is as clear in Family Guy's case as in almost any long-running show you could cite. But the conventional wisdom misses something important, which is that the decline was not inevitable in the sense of being predetermined by the nature of long-running television. The decline was the product of specific choices about who was running the show, about what kinds of stories the show would tell, about what relationship the show would maintain with its audience, about what purposes the controversy it generated would serve. American Dad, which has run for a comparable period, has not experienced a comparable decline. This is not because American Dad is immune to the institutional pressures that affect long-running shows. It is because the people running American Dad have made different choices, consistently, across many seasons. The lesson this teaches is not that creative longevity is impossible for shows that want to be genuinely good. It is that creative longevity requires active, sustained attention to the choices that determine whether a show maintains its integrity or loses it. It requires the willingness to say no to storylines that would be commercially convenient but creatively damaging. It requires the willingness to change what is not working rather than defending it because it is familiar. It requires the humility to recognize when a show's methods have become counterproductive, and the courage to change those methods even when changing them is risky. Family Guy, particularly in its post-revival seasons, consistently made the less courageous choices. It defended its methods even when those methods were producing declining quality. It prioritized commercial stability over creative risk. It chose familiar dysfunction over unfamiliar growth. These choices produced the arc that we have documented tonight, the arc from genuinely ambitious, controversial television to commercially calculated simulation of ambitious television. That arc is not a tragedy in the sense of being unavoidable. It is a tragedy in the sense of being the product of specific choices that could have been made differently. And understanding which choices were made, and why, and what they produced, is the beginning of understanding how not to make the same choices in the creative work that comes after. That is perhaps the most useful thing that 3 hours of Family Guy controversy can teach us. Not a verdict on whether the show was good or bad. Not a ranking of its episodes or its seasons or its characters. But a map of the choices that were made, the directions they pointed, and the places they eventually led. That map is worth studying both for what it reveals about this specific show and for what it suggests about the conditions under which genuinely ambitious creative work can sustain itself over time. Thanks for watching. Thanks for being here. Subscribe if you haven't already. It keeps this kind of sustained, detailed, honest conversation possible. And drop a comment telling me what you think, what I missed, or what you'd like to see covered next. Good night. End of script. The final extended section. Reflections on watching these episodes in a different era. There is something genuinely strange about watching the controversial episodes of Family Guy in 2025 or 2026. The cultural moment that produced them, the specific anxieties, the specific fault lines, the specific debates that made each episode land the way it landed when it first aired has shifted considerably. Some of the debates have moved on. Some of the positions that seemed transgressive in 2009 are mainstream today. Some of the things that seemed like edgy boundary pushing have curdled into something that looks different in retrospect. Watching 420 now, in a world where roughly half of American states have legalized recreational marijuana and where the subject has lost most of its cultural charge as a political flashpoint, is a different experience from watching it in 2009. The episode's central satire that even someone with genuine convictions about a political issue will abandon those convictions the moment they are personally offered something they want remains sharp and permanently relevant. But the specific texture of the controversy it generated, the fact that Brian's pro-legalization campaign was itself controversial content, has evaporated. The episode reads differently when the position it was arguing for has become mainstream. Watching Not All Dogs Go to Heaven now, In a world where public atheism has become considerably more normalized, and where the specific social ostracism of non-belief that the episode depicted seems more historically situated than it did in 2009, is similarly altered. The episode's heavy-handedness is still visible, but the specific urgency that the subject had in 2009, the sense that depicting an atheist as a pariah was depicting something that actually happened to real people in real communities, has softened somewhat. As American culture has become more comfortable with publicly identified non-believers, watching Quagmire's Dad now, in a world where transgender representation in media has become a subject of intense and sophisticated ongoing debate, where the frameworks for understanding what responsible representation looks like are much more fully developed than they were in 2010, is perhaps the most altered experience of all. The episode's failures are more visible from this vantage point, not less. The 30-second vomiting sequence looks worse in 2025 than it did in 2010, because 2025 has more context for understanding what that sequence communicates and more alternatives to compare it against. And watching partial terms of endearment, or rather, knowing that it exists and cannot be watched through any normal American channel, is perhaps the most eerie experience of all, because the specific cultural moment that made it unwatchable has passed, and yet the episode remains suppressed. The 2010 calculus that led Fox to bury it has not been revisited in any official way, and the episode continues to exist in its strange limbo reviewed by British critics, released on DVD, fully part of the show's production record, and completely absent from the American streaming catalogs that make every other episode of the show accessible. These time-shifted experiences of controversial content are themselves a kind of argument for why this kind of sustained, detailed analysis matters. Controversies do not stay the same. They evolve as the culture around them evolves. What was shocking in 2009 may be unremarkable in 2025. What was considered marginally acceptable in 2010 may look genuinely harmful from the vantage point of 15 years of subsequent understanding. Tracking these changes, understanding why specific episodes landed the way they landed when they landed, and how the same content reads differently across different moments is the work of cultural history. It is the work of understanding not just what happened, but why it happened, and what it means. Family Guy's controversial history is, among other things, a record of American cultural anxieties across roughly 2.5 decades. The anxieties about abortion and reproductive rights, the anxieties about transgender identity and what it means for the categories that American culture had built its self-understanding around, the anxieties about drug policy and the regulatory frameworks that defined American life, the anxieties about religious identity and the relationship between faith and public discourse, the anxieties about gender and who has the right to tell stories about whose experiences. All of these anxieties were present in American culture before Family Guy engaged with them. All of them are still present, in evolved forms, after the episodes engaging with them have faded from the immediate cultural conversation. The episodes themselves are time capsules, imperfect, often flawed, sometimes harmful, occasionally genuinely valuable records of a specific culture grappling with specific questions at a specific moment. That is the final word on Family Guy's controversial history. It is a record. An imperfect, often frustrating, sometimes genuinely impressive record of a show that kept reaching toward difficult subjects across 25 years of American cultural life, that kept getting into trouble, and that kept generating exactly the kinds of conversations that difficult subjects require. The record is worth having. The conversations were worth having. The reaching, however imperfect, was worth doing. Thanks for being here for all of it. End of script. A brief note on what we have built tonight. Looking back at everything covered in this script, from the banned episode that America never officially saw, through the domestic violence episode that got the psychology fundamentally wrong, through the death of a cartoon dog that was engineered for ratings, through the marijuana episode that provoked a South American government to ban an animated show entirely, what strikes me most is how consistent the underlying questions are across all of it. Every controversy at its root is asking the same thing. What is comedy allowed to do, and who decides? The FCC had one answer. The Parents Television Council had another. The Venezuelan government had a third. The transgender community had a fourth. Andrea Faye Friedman, speaking from her own experience as a person with Down syndrome, had a fifth one that directly contradicted Sarah Palin's answer, even though Palin claimed to be speaking on behalf of people like Friedman. None of these answers is complete. None of them is simply wrong. They are different answers rooted in different experiences, different values, different relationships to the power that comedy can exercise over how groups of people are perceived and treated. The controversies we have discussed tonight were the places where those different answers collided most visibly and most consequentially. Family Guy was, for 25 years, the place where those collisions happened with unusual frequency and unusual force. That is not a small thing. It is not something that happens by accident. It takes a show that is genuinely reaching, that is trying to say something real about the world it inhabits, to generate that many genuine collisions with that many genuine points of cultural friction. The reaching was real, the collisions were real, the record they produced is real, and the fact that you are here, at the end of 3 hours of thinking about all of it, is the most genuine testimony to that reality that I can imagine. Thank you for watching. Subscribe, comment, come back next time.